So hey guys, how are you all? Welcome to So we are back with a brand new movie on What If Naruto Was Marriage Robin at Young Age movie, but before we start, be sure to subscribe to our channel and like this video. Now let's begin the story. He ran away. No, that's wrong, saying that would mean he had left willingly. No, it hadn't been much of a choice. Naruto had been chased out and was now on the run, all because he was a half-breed. At least that is what they said. It was the reason for why he was never allowed to play with the children, or enter any of the shops and pretty much everything else a kid would normally go. For as long as he could remember, the people in Konoha hated him. They hated him for what he was and for what he might turn out to be capable of. All his life Naruto had lived in a village full of shinobi. Such life is hard for everyone who takes a part in it. The code of conduct was harsh and morals are almost non-existent. It wasn't in any way an easy way of living. Konoha though was slightly different in what was supposedly the norm. In the elemental nations, the land of fire was considered weak and outright foolish for holding on to what they themselves called the will of fire. The loyalty one has to their village and the determination to fight for it. The men there were loyal to their fellow shinobi. The women could be just as strong and fierce as their husbands. Murder was frowned upon unless in self-defense, and the civilians were treated with respect. Everyone knew Konoha was different, and yet despite that Naruto wasn't treated well, he'd never been able to wrap his head around it, and even now he still didn't understand. Not everyone acted this way where it concerned him. The leader of the village, the Hokage, was nice to him and somewhat of a grandfather figure to him. The man had always tried to help him in any way he could, but not even someone thought to be the god of shinobi could change the hearts of his people. The man was one of the only people in the village Naruto had been able to turn to. According to the old man, his mother had been a half-breed just like him, while his father had been a human. That was pretty much everything he knew about them though. Whenever they would talk about the couple, the old man would get this faraway look and sigh. He would look so forlorn that Naruto wouldn't have the guts to pry for an answer. His time in the village hadn't been only bad things though. Living in a shinobi village did have its perks. The library was full of cool jutsu and information, though books weren't really his thing. Now the training grounds though, that was something else entirely. When Naruto started the Shinobi Academy several years early, he had been excited beyond compare. He'd finally make his mark on the world and show them just how awesome he could be. That quickly turned into disappointment as teachers refused to help him with his work and the other kids avoided him as their parents had told them to. A place to learn quickly turned into another area in the village he would gladly avoid. Despite that, it had been the academy that led him to a number of training grounds in Konoha, several of which hadn't been disclosed to civilians and pre-genin. It had happened when he followed one of the teachers from the academy to prank him. The man had taken a route Naruto himself hadn't really noticed before. Of course that in itself had been odd. He did know every corner of Konoha after all. But really though, that hadn't been something he'd focused on for long. For had been revealed to him was an entire other way of doing things. Apparently when one was of a higher rank, they had regular get-together to train in bigger groups. Whether in pairs, quadrants, of even multiple team combined. The amount of techniques demonstrated was staggering. Now while Naruto knew he wouldn't be able to use most of them for a long time, some of the techniques did make him a bit curious. Observing them every day had quickly become one of his favorite pastimes. He'd gleaned hints as how to improve on his strengths, and every now and then he'd see something he could actually look up. A few rare times he'd made a successful attempt to listen in on a lecture about chakra control techniques. Though it had been more of an overview of things they already knew. Still, it had been very helpful for him. It had definitely helped improve his stealth and speed. The two strengths Naruto was proud of, though nobody ever believed him when he said so. Ever since Naruto was able to stand on two legs, he had been quick. He could keep pace with some of the fastest in the village. He was pretty sure he could beat most shinobi if they didn't use that strange flickering technique. He never did know why, but even without his speeds he was still slightly more gifted than the other children his age. Not in book smarts though, never in theory. No, he could beat them with tactics, speed, and just plain improvisation. He wasn't even the strongest. He was strong for an 8-year-old, but any veteran could beat him if used their tactics and experience against him. But Naruto could keep them busy and he could use his speed to escape. Despite being treated the way he was for something he could not control, he still loved Konoha. He swore to someday make them acknowledge him for who he was. Now though, that wasn't possible anymore. He had been chased out by a great group of people, and some of them he'd even recognized as capable shinobi with influence in Konoha. What had actually forced him to turn his back on his old village had been the look in their eyes. Naruto had always held some kind of hope that, just like Iruka, the people of Konoha would eventually come to see him for who he was. If he became Hokage, he would have the chance to show everyone he wasn't some kind of monster. But when he saw their eyes, the same eyes that were filled with love and adoration as they fell on their spouse, their children, their family, the same that were said to be the windows to one's soul, Now though Naruto didn't ever want to believe that last saying to be true because each and every one of those eyes were shadowed. Shadowed by the hatred, dislike and plain disgust they held for him. The emotions were so clearly expressed in their facial expression, their eyes and even in the weapons they held. They hated him, and with this he himself could believe so too. But why him? He hadn't done anything wrong. If he did, he couldn't even remember it. He'd cried the night he left. His few friends had come to say goodbye and good luck. Luckily enough, he was one of the fastest in Konoha and there wouldn't be anyone chasing after him. Either they thought he wasn't worth the attempt or he'd actually make them work for it. After months of trying to survive and countless of meeting with dangerous people and shinobi, he finally reached the end of his nerves. He'd been on the run constantly with nowhere to go, and Naruto knew he'd been extremely lucky to have even survived for so long, but he was lonely and fed up with everything. Other villages did not accept him as his village Konoha was seen as one of the most powerful, but also one of the most disrespected and ridiculed. They didn't want someone who was banished from there and be seen as their enemy, but at the same time they didn't believe his child from that place to turn into something worthy of their attention. It was the foremost reason he couldn't settle down anywhere. They'd always find out and throw him out. And because of that he decided to leave the elemental nations and go into the outside world. That is where his adventure would begin. How long is this ocean going to keep on going? I've been walking for days," shouted Naruto over the blue horizon as he listened to the waves. He had definitely been walking for days and hardly had any more food or water. It was surprising how painful it is to have no water to drink while walking in a place with only water. Well, he wasn't taking a chance and drinking seawater, but it was still frustrating. Over the last few days he'd been running over the sea non-stop. Knowing the old man in a village of shinobi had been useful. The Hokage had caught on to his huge amount of reserves in chakra quickly and showed him multiple ways to improve his control. He'd explained that chakra was the energy by which shinobi could use their amazing techniques. Naruto had grown up seeing the amazing things all the ninja could do and had always yearned to do the same. When the old man actually started helping him with, he found out it was hard work. He complained a lot about it. After all, learning to stand on water and climb trees was cool, but he wanted to be the Hokage. He didn't have time to learn all those stupid chakra techniques. He wanted to learn how to control fire or shoot a beam from his hands. Besides, what kind of Hokage meditates? The old man should be taking him to help save a princess or two, maybe help a village on the way. Eventually he had gotten told off and the importance of chakra control was drilled into his head. In the end he never gave up trying to learn them. One of the techniques he learned was water walking, and the amazing thing was that he learned it before he was of age to graduate. Not that I can ever graduate now, Naruto thought sadly. He shook his head to chase away the negative thoughts and looked out over the never-ending horizon. I really need to plan my ideas more, he mumbled as he kept walking, but took on a more leisurely pace to spare the energy he had left. When he'd left the elemental nations he'd snuck onto a boat as it was about to leave. For several days everything had gone exactly according to plan. But a week into his journey he'd been a bit clumsy and tripped down the stairs as he ravaged for food. Let's just say that particular boat wasn't very big and it didn't have quite as many hiding places as Naruto had first thought. So it had turned into a hiking trip, hopefully with the end in sight somewhere soon. It was finally after hours had passed that slowly but surely a bit of land came into sight. Naruto started running towards it before he even fully realized what it meant. The entire time he felt a small amount of hope. Maybe now he'd finally find a friend, someone he could spend time with. When he finally reached the island he jumped onto the ground and collapsed immediately of fatigue and drifted into darkness. Ushi walked through the forest holding her book and went to sit down on an old tree trunk, opening her book to read. Ever since she was small Robin had loved to read. Knowledge was something she yearned. Learning new things and knowing how something worked, what could ever be better than that? Not everyone agreed though. Her family treated her horribly and nearly everyone called her a monster. She knew why though, having these creepy powers. She shook her head to chase away the nasty thoughts and returned to her book. Before she had the chance to even read the first sentence though, she felt something hard hit the side of her head. Yatta, we hit the monster. She looked around and saw some of the villager kids on the other side of the clearing with food in their hands. She touched the side of her head and saw that her hands were red. It wasn't blood though. She smelled the substance briefly before recognizing it. It was a tomato, quite an old one. Before she could do anything she was hit by another one. Haha, go back to where you came from, monster. Monsters like you don't deserve to be here. She turned to the kids and glared at them. They flinched but quickly composed themselves and continued throwing things. After 3 more hits she had had enough and waved her hands in a circular gesture. As soon as she did so, multiple hands appeared out of nowhere and gave each of the kids a soft slap on their heads before disappearing again. The kids who had been hit were clutching their heads tightly. Ouch! That hurt you, demon. I'm gonna tell mom and you're gonna be in big trouble, one of them shouted. the other saying something similar before running away. To be honest, Robin couldn't care less about them and started to walk away. After a couple of minutes of walking, she finally reached her house. It was at the edge of the forest, so she didn't have to go through the village. She opened the door and entered the house. "Roji Obasan, sorry I'm late," she said politely. There was no answer, the lights were out and she heard nothing in the house. She shrugged a bit in disinterest and walked over to the table. Quite soon she noticed a note laying there written to her. "To Robin, it's our daughter's birthday today, so we've decided to have a private dinner, with no outsiders. We have some bread, so eat that for your dinner. Don't use too much jam though. When you're done with your dinner, finish cleaning, wash the dishes, and bring in the laundry before we come home. Don't forget to go upstairs before it gets too late." Roji, without looking at the note a second time, she started her chores. It wasn't really anything new for her. Ever since she was 2 she had been looked after by Roji because her mother had left without her. They already had a son and because of that they didn't pay her any attention. She was used as a maid around the house. After an hour of scrubbing she was done. She ate some bread and left the house and went into the forest. Ever since she could remember she loved the forest. It was peaceful and she could be alone here without anyone interrupting her. Well, almost always. She continued her walk and stopped every now and then to check her surroundings for anything interesting. After about an hour of walking, Robin arrived at the beach and sat down to read, but before she started she noticed something lying on the beach. Not being able to see exactly what it was, she stood up and walked over. As soon as she came close enough to recognize what it was, she gasped. It was a young boy about her age. He had sun-kissed hair and 3 whiskers like scars on each cheek. His clothes weren't in their best shape, but they also seemed very old and worn, as if it was the only pair he had. She sat down next to him and checked his pulse. It's still there and strong, so it doesn't seem like his life is in any danger. It was relieving though. She swung her arm and a lot of arms appeared in 2 rows lined up behind one another. The first arms picked the boy up and passed him onto the second arms, continuing the process until slowly they reached the forest, where they put him down. As the arms moved the boy, she slowly followed them and observed him. She wondered what to do with him for a bit before sitting down leaning against the tree right next to him. She observed him for a little while longer before opening her book and continuing to read. Naruto opened his sky-colored eyes and looked around, but before he was really aware of anything his instincts kicked in and he soon held a kunai against the neck of someone next to him. "He" was the first thing he heard. He looked up and realized it was just a girl. Someone around his age. Normally he would have retracted his kunai, but considering all that had happened in the last few months he kept it there until he was sure he could trust her. Better safe than sorry. In Konoha, the village he grew up in, he'd only been taught how to defend himself for a bit. The old man didn't want to teach him besides the basic and very much needed chakra control. But the people in the elemental nations were very strong by origin. Naruto could defend himself easily against the civilians, but for the more experienced he had to rely on speed and wit. After he'd been chased out it got worse. Being chased all over and back had gotten him stronger and he'd acquired some experience. He could now put up a decent fight against a shinobi that wasn't considered strong in his home. What he didn't know though was that the standards in the elemental nations were very high. Even a normal civilian would be considered quite strong outside of the elemental nations. "Where am I and who are you?" She looked nervous and tried to speak, but he could see the kunai against her throat was a bit too much for her. Seeing as she didn't pose a threat, he put away the kunai and took a different approach. "Sorry, I didn't know if you were someone dangerous or not," Naruto said as he stood up and patted the dust of his clothes, or at least what was left of them. He really needed to buy some new clothing. If this was anywhere other than the elemental nations, then they shouldn't know about him and his peculiarities, and let him buy some normal clothing. "Why would I be someone dangerous?" He turned around and looked at her. He was a bit surprised she hadn't run yet. He had suspected her to either still be frozen in fear or running the heck away from here. But even now she was still looking at him as if he was the most interesting thing around. He would never admit it, but it looked as if he were a book of some kind. One that would give her some new knowledge she desperately wanted. He straightened up slightly. "Well, I have pretty much had to defend myself my whole life from people you would never think of as dangerous." She nodded and started to get up. She walked towards him and held out her hand. "Well, nice to meet you. I'm Nico Robin and I think I get what you mean." He looked at her while deciding what to say. "Nice to meet you, I guess. I'm Uzumaki D. Naruto. But why would you be attacked?" She looked up and blushed. She waved her hand and suddenly he was surrounded by hands that were sprouting from all kinds of places. He backed off and tripped over a branch, landing on his butt. "Wah! Where the hell did those come from?" Robin had expected that reaction. People always did, and soon after they would start calling her demon or monster. She waited for the rejection, bracing herself, while watching the boy on the ground looking shocked. He opened his mouth to say something. "That is so cool. How did you do that? Can I learn it?" He looked at her with sparkles in his eyes. She looked at him shocked about his reaction before composing herself. She shook her head lightly. Sorry, only I can do this, it's because of the devil fruit that I ate when I was small. She saw him looking at her as if she were talking in a foreign language and decided to explain a bit more on the subject. After all, maybe he wasn't born on an island in the Grand Line. It's a special kind of fruit, that when you eat one you gain special powers. The only side effect is that you become a hammer in water and will never be able to swim again. He, HMMD, and stood up. Well, considering you showed me your secret, I guess I should show you mine. She nodded and he did a backward jump. Halfway the jump his body started to shine lightly and his form changed into that of a fox. When he landed he was fully shaped as a fox, or rather somewhat of Kit. He was now entirely covered in fur that was the same sun-kissed yellow as his hair had been. He had one tail with a black tip on the end. On his stomach he had a white coloring that reached up to his snout. He had blood-red eyes that shined as if there were jewels placed inside of them, and around his eyes he had a black line that separated the bottom white half of his snout from the top yellow half. Robin stared at him in awe, and before she could control her actions she started to pet him and scratch him behind the ears. Naruto was just as shocked as Robin had been. People didn't just pet half-breed yokai, though when he thought about it he looked just like a fox that was just slightly bigger than usual. When she had shown him her powers he decided to show her his. He thought that if she would start to hate him, he would at least know it beforehand and wouldn't be disappointed if they became friends. If she told the rest of the people in the neighborhood, he could always sneak and steal something. It would only return to how it had been. Better have his share of reality now than have his hopes crushed again later. She continued petting him and he was enjoying every minute of it. Before he knew it he was sitting down and relaxing while she continued to pet him. After a while she picked up her book from the ground and started to read again while she continued to run her fingers through his fur. They sat like this the entire evening until it started to become dark and she had to return. He changed back to his human form and she stood up. So Naruto, what are you going to do? She looked him in the eyes and he was immediately grateful that she didn't fear or hate him. He realized he was hoping to become friends with her but pushed the feeling down in fear of being betrayed again. Well, I guess I'll stay here for a while. I need to rest before I can continue, and there is a forest so I can stay here. She made an agreeing sound and started walking down the path. He followed. Nay, Robin. Hi. She stopped and faced him. Why aren't you afraid of me or asking me why I can do that? You explained your powers to me, so why shouldn't I? She looked down and thought, well, you brought up the story and I did it mostly to show you I don't mean any harm, but you don't seem like you want to talk about it. I'll listen when and if you want to tell me. He looked her in the eyes as she lifted her face. Why do you already trust me that much? We've hardly known each other for a few hours. She turned around and continued walking. Well, I think it's because we're similar. I don't know, but everyone in this village calls me a demon or a monster. He flinched when she said that but followed after her as she talked. But you didn't judge me like I expected you to. I think you know what it feels like to be hated. She stopped and turned around. But that's just a feeling I have, so don't worry about it. She was about to turn back but he decided to answer that thought. I do know what that feels like, and if that's the reason I feel like we'll be great friends, he said in a childish and innocent way he hadn't got to for a long time. She stopped and turned around so quickly he almost thought her neck would snap or something similar. He could see she had a hint tears in her eyes and he started to panic. Are you alright? Ooh, is it something I said? Something I did? Please say you're alright. I really don't know what to do when girls start to cry. But while he was ranting on about what to do she started to giggle and slowly burst out in laughing. What? I really don't get you. First you're crying and now you're laughing. He looked at Head exasperated. After Robin stopped laughing and started to breathe again she stood up. Dad, it was funny seeing you panic, but what I wanted to say was, arigato. I've never had friends before and would be really happy to have you as a friend. I'll come by here again tomorrow. See you then. She turned around and ran away, leaving a frozen Naruto behind on his own. Naruto was walking around the forest. He had spent the night hunting, collecting food or resting. Slowly the night had turned to day and he wanted to see Robin and the island. She had said she would come to the forest but never said when, thus Naruto had decided to go look for her. Being half fox did have its quirks. He had an incredible smell. Aside from maybe the Inuzuka, who specialized in scenting, there probably weren't many humans that could compete with him on the matter. He sniffed around for a bit trying to find the right scent, and it didn't take long before he found the now familiar scent of parchment and flowers. He didn't want to go to the village quite yet. After Robin told him that they didn't accept her he didn't think he could trust them. He followed her scent and quickly realized that it was also moving away from the village. Naruto continued to move after it and soon found himself standing in front of one huge tree. The tree was, in no way definition of the word, small. It was 9 to 10 times the height of what would normally be a very tall tree and had the width of at least a couple of houses. He stared up and found he couldn't even see the top, even with his enhanced sense of sight. Moving closer, he could smell Robin's scent coming from inside the tree. How am I going to enter a tree? He absently thought as he continued to circle the base. 10 minutes later, he was almost halfway circling the tree as he didn't know what to do otherwise. It turned out to be the right decision though, because on the other side there was a door. What a door would be doing on a tree, though, he probably wouldn't understand. He sighed and knocked on it and waited for a couple of seconds, but as soon as he didn't get an answer, he knocked again. This time, though, he did heard movement inside. He waited for a couple of seconds before the door opened. I thought I heard someone knock on the door, but... The guy who answered the door mused to himself. Naruto had expected someone to open the door, and that person might be surprised that a kid like himself would knock on the door. But this guy actually managed to literally look over him. He knew he was small, but this just pissed him off. Down here, never had a kid knock on your door before? He knew it wasn't polite to say such a thing as a greeting, but he didn't like someone messing with his height, directly or indirectly. The man turned to look down and to his pleasure managed to paint the picture of remorse with his expression. Sorry boy, I didn't see you there. Let me start again, might I help you? Naruto straightened and looked up. The guy seemed nice enough, so he started again. No problem, I just don't like people messing with my height, but I understand you didn't mean to. He gave the man his brightest smile. Anyway, I came here because I wanted to see Robin. Is she here? If the man was surprised, he managed to keep it well hidden. Well, yes, she is here, but why do you want to see her? The man looked at him with a stern expression, and Naruto realized that since Robin wasn't treated well by this village, he wouldn't easily trust someone with Robin, so he spoke honestly. Well, I made friends with Robin yesterday and she said she'd come by to visit me later, but I realized she didn't tell me when, so decided to come look for her. The man looked like he was thinking for a second before he moved away from the doorway and motioned Naruto inside. Naruto studied the man as they walked through the hallway. The man was, well, really weird. He literally had hair in the form of a clover, one with 3 leaves. One leaf was his beard, which was long and had the form of a leaf. It was tied to his chin with a piece of lint. The other 2 leaves were 2 ponytails which were tied up on the side of his head. It looked really weird, but he wouldn't mention it to the older man. So how did you meet Robin? He looked the man in the eyes and saw the same he had seen in Robin's eyes. Why do you have the same eyes as Robin? The man looked surprised for a second, and Naruto inwardly cursed for saying something that he wasn't going to say out loud. What do you mean? The older man asked him curiously. Naruto swore his eyes were twinkling when he asked. Well, yesterday I kinda did an unexpected action, and as soon as I turned around and looked at her, she just looked at me as if I was some kind of book that would teach her something new. As soon as he said that, the man burst out laughing. Thinking he had said something ridiculous, Naruto turned a bright red tint and looked down in embarrassment. The man looked at Naruto and saw his red ears as he could not see the face. Oh, sorry, it's just your analogy was spot on. He noticed Naruto looking at him as he was crazy and realized a problem he didn't usually have with Robin. Analogy is using an example to portray something. Like saying that someone's hair looks like a duck's ass. At this, Naruto started laughing and nodded, showing the man he understood. At the okay signal, the man continued. Well, what you said is exactly right, that is why it's funny. You see, here at the Tree of Knowledge we archaeologists gather to study and gain knowledge, and just today Robin was officially recognized as an archaeologist. She loves knowledge, and as such she probably thought you were going to tell her something she didn't know yet, he explained to Naruto. While they were talking, they walked through the hallway until reaching a door, but just before opening it he stopped. Young man, I'm sorry, but I seem to have forgotten to ask you what your name is. Naruto did a short polite bow and gave him another smile. Well, I'm Uzumaki D. Naruto, but call me Naruto. And who are you, old man? The man's eyes widened for a bit, glinting with something similar to shock and maybe recognition. But he quickly hid it and did a sweat drop at being called old. Well, I am Professor Clover, head archaeologist on this island Ohara. After having been introduced to each other, the newly named Clover opened the door. If Naruto didn't know that it was impossible for one's eyes to pop out, he would have said they did, because the inside of the tree was huge. Rows after rows after rows of books were put in cupboards that went all the way up to the top of the tree. A height he couldn't see properly even with his eyes. He had never seen so many books before. He nearly wondered briefly there even was so much to know about the world. Seeing as Naruto was frozen, Professor Clover took the lead. Follow me, Naruto, I think I know where you'll find Robin. Listening to Professor Clover, Naruto followed him through the mountains of books and up the stairs. After climbing several stairs, they finally reached a leveled area where several tables were put out, probably for reading. Naruto mused. But as soon as they fully reached the floor, he saw Robin sitting there reading and ran up to her. Robin. She looked up and saw Naruto. After seeing who it was, she smiled and waved. He walked to her and sat down. You don't mind that I came looking for ya, do you? She shook her head and smiled again before returning to her book. He looked at the title and saw she was reading some kind of book on round rainbows. Looking around all the books, he suddenly had an idea. If they have any book on shinobi, they had to have it here, so he walked to Professor Clover. "Nay, Professor Clover, do you have any books here on shinobi or jutsu?" Professor Clover looked surprised at the young boy, but that expression soon turned to a slightly sterner one. "And why would you know about that? Not many people are aware of the elemental nations and even less of the terms they use there." Naruto looked at him confused before he slapped his head for realizing he had forgotten that he wasn't in the elemental nations anymore, and since they were shinobi, other parts of the world would not know. "Sorry, Professor Clover, I forgot. I am from the elemental nations and had to leave because of certain reasons. But I want to continue training, and I thought that if there are so many books here, you must have information about almost anything here." He smiled sheepishly while explaining. Professor Clover just looked at him with surprise, before managing to answer Naruto's question. "Well, the amount of information we have is minimal, though, as you said we do have some. Would you be willing to verify it if you could?" Naruto thought about it before answering. "Yes, if it's verifying I don't mind, but as you know, shinobi are based on secrecy, and as such I cannot tell you anything new." Naruto told him seriously. He may have been chased out of his home, but even now he still had his honor of being a shinobi. Besides, he'd been raised as one. You wouldn't think it seeing his character, but Naruto was one who'd taken well to stealth. Professor Clover stared at the young boy before answering. "Yes, that is understandable and very admirable. Though I wonder how they manage to keep so much secret and even manage to keep a young boy such as yourself keep it willingly. I will see if I can go get some of the books now. Have fun, you too, Robin." He looked at her and she absently waved to him before returning to her book. He joined her at the table and went through some of the books looking for something interesting. After about an hour, Naruto was beginning to lose patience. He was never one for reading if it didn't have anything to do with training or stories. "Nay, Robin, how can you keep reading for so long?" Robin looked up from her book, half surprised and mused for a bit before answering. "Well, I suppose I just like learning new things, don't you?" He looked at her and answered, "Well, yeah, but for me that doesn't mean everything. I like learning things that help me protect my precious people, meaning I like learning new things that will help me in my training." She looked at him questioningly, and so he elaborated a bit more. "I mean like, learning how to fight better, or what the right way to handle a sword is, about which poisons are dangerous and so on. Things that can make a difference in life and death." She looked at him with an odd expression before standing up and walking away. "Robin. Hey Robin, where are you going?" He was about to stand up when she came back. "Here." She handed him 3 books, "though I don't know much about shinobi, so I can't help you with that. These books are about martial arts of some country, other ways of being stealthy, and the last is one on survival methods. I don't know if that helps." He thanked her excitedly and gave her a big hug before sitting down and starting to read. All without noticing her slightly red-tinted face. While all of this happened, they didn't notice that at least half of the staff of the Tree of Knowledge was watching what had happened with growing smiles on their faces. They were all thinking about how Naruto was a good influence on Robin. The girl had no friends her age on the island. Professor Clover was the first to speak among them. "I hope they can help one another. If that boy is really from the elemental nations, then I doubt his life has been an easy one." All of them nodded and returned to their work while hoping the kids would become good friends who could help each other. Naruto continued to read the books that Robin had given him, but he was having a lot of trouble. Back at the village he grew up and he hadn't been taught much about these kind of things, especially literature. He could read and understand a bit, but a lot of it was difficult. He kept stopping at every sentence as soon as there was a word he didn't understand. Robin noticed this after a while and put down her book. "Is something wrong, Naruto?" But he just kept staring at his book and sighed before slamming his head onto the table. "I don't get it," he yelled. Robin giggled a bit at the sight before the words registered. "Is it that hard?" Naruto kept his head down on the table but tried to shake his head. Robin realized he was saying no and frowned a bit. "It's not hard. But then what is the problem?" She watched as Naruto slowly lifted his head and looked away, slightly red in the face. "The stuff isn't that hard, but I don't get most of the words," he mumbled, ashamed. Naruto thought she was going to burst out laughing at him for being so stupid, but when he didn't hear anything he turned to her. Robin, though, had just grabbed the book and read a bit of it. After a few minutes she put the book back down. "Naruto, there's nothing to be ashamed about. This book is quite difficult and we're only 8. He just stared at her before asking back for the book. "Then why do you get it?" he asked. Robin had just read it and didn't seem to not understand it. "I grew up here and I love reading. After reading so much my vocabulary got much better. I am an archaeologist, you know." She puffed out her chest slightly with pride. Naruto grinned when she said the last sentence and bowed over the table towards her until he was very close. Robin had no idea what he was doing until he whispered something to her. "Even though you only became 1 today?" he said smartly. Robin blushed, being caught at bragging a bit before Naruto started laughing and held his stomach. It took a few minutes for him to calm down. Don't worry, RO. I just heard that from Professor Clover. Besides, I think it's amazing you're already an archaeologist. It means you have to study a lot, right? I don't think I could do that. Grinning sheepishly, he didn't even notice Robin turn an even brighter red as he said all of that. Robin calmed her heartbeat and her breathing when she noticed something. RO? Naruto looked up, put his arms over each other and thought about it for a bit before his face lit up. Ooh, sorry. He said, chuckling a bit. It's RO from Robin. It's like a nickname, sorry if you don't like it. But Robin, who'd figured out the reason as he talked, started to shake. He had. No, I like it. I just wondered what it was, Naru. Adding the last bit with a slight smirk. Naruto smiled brightly at her for the little nickname before he took the books he was reading back from her. So RO? Do you think you could help me with this? Pointing to the book he'd been reading before. Robin just smiled and nodded. Of course, what do you want to know? Naruto blushed slightly as he pointed to the many words he didn't understand, but it slowly disappeared as Robin just started to explain each word patiently until he understood and could continue reading the book. Occasionally having to get another book to understand things better. A month later, and Naruto could honestly say he had never been as happy with his life as he was now. In the last month he had slowly gotten to know Robin better and even found his place at the Tree of Life. Apparently Naruto was pretty smart for his age, not as smart as everyone there, but considering they were all archaeologists this wasn't very surprising. As a shinobi he knew how to climb walls without using his hands, and so he could easily do training this way while cleaning up books at the same time. This way he could stay at the tree while everyone else had to work and still do something to help them and not be in the way. To say they had been surprised was an understatement. He could easily say that he fell down laughing when he saw their faces after he showed them he could walk on the walls. In the last month Naruto had also come to know a lot of things. First of all, Robin really wasn't treated all that well in this village. She was treated with the same amount of respect Naruto had in Konoha, which was practically none. The only difference was that they weren't physically hurting her, well besides throwing things at her. Ooh, and she had the archaeologists to go to. Nonetheless, though it was horrible, Naruto made it a point to stay with her for as long as possible before returning to the forest. Professor Clover had also gotten some books on shinobi for Naruto, who was surprised to see that all the information they had was true. It was quite the accomplishment considering the secrecy the elemental nations are sworn to, and he complimented Professor Clover on it. Although the information they had wouldn't be of much use to anyone who couldn't use chakra, which he thought was pretty much anyone outside of the elemental nations. The amount of chakra he had encountered on his trip to Ohara hadn't once reached above civilian level. But thanks to the books he could continue training, and he even found a way to improve his chakra control by practicing with leaves on his body while training, a method he'd been taught before. His old man had preferred meditation. Another thing he figured out was his elemental nature, although there wasn't any special paper to check for certain. In the book there was another method which was kind of far-fetched considering all the things you had to do, but nonetheless he eventually figured out that his element was wind and lightning. With wind probably being his foremost, but he had no way of checking without that whatever you call it piece of paper. Naruto and Robin had gotten even closer in the last month, and they had each shared more details of their past with each other. Like how they were treated and who were precious to them. Although Naruto had come to see how Robin was treated in the past, considering it hadn't changed much from what it was like now. Robin though had come to see Naruto in a new light, as his life had been much harder than the one she was living. But he was still very protective of his home village, though he didn't leave without accumulating some hatred for them. They slowly but surely were growing closer to one another and were becoming nearly inseparable when together. Today though something was different. He had a feeling that something very important was going to happen today. Naruto had told only Robin of him being half fox, as though he did trust the archaeologists. He hadn't fully recovered from being chased from the village, and he in no way wanted to repeat that. So he had yet to tell them. He entered the Tree of Knowledge and walked up the stairs to where he always sits with Robin, but after waiting for 10 minutes he didn't see Robin and decided to look for her. Walking down the stairs he took another turn where he found Robin hiding behind a door. He walked towards her and blew in her ear softly. She jumped up and looked behind her, seeing Naruto with a huge smile on his face. She pouted slightly. Naruto, why did you do that? I am listening to something very important. He smiled another sheepish smile before turning to his attention back to her, interested in what she had said. Important? How? Tell me too. She thought about it before nodding to herself. Well, Professor Clover and the rest have been studying these hieroglyphs called poneglyphs for ages now to find out what happened in the void of 100 years. She turned to Naruto and saw him looking at her with a blank look. This period became known as the Void Century because there is nothing left to acknowledge anything that happened in it, aside from the poneglyphs, which are written in a language that few know how to read. Professor Clover and the rest are studying it, and I wanted to, but when I went to tell them that I could help when I became an archaeologist, he became mad, saying it is forbidden to study poneglyphs and it is dangerous. So if they find me here I might not be allowed back. You won't tell, right? She put up her puppy eye face and he knew he couldn't win, but he wouldn't go down without a fight. What should I do? She looked a bit disappointed thinking he was going to tell on her. Naruto grinned. Nah, I won't tell, plus it seems interesting. She smiled and they turned back to the door. So what are these poneglyphs? He heard a soft thud and turned to Robin, seeing her on the floor with a sweat drop. If you didn't know then why agree? Well anyway, poneglyph are mysterious stone blocks with history inscribed onto them, and these blocks are scattered all over the Grand Line. The government has apparently forbidden anyone to research or study them. I don't know why though. According to Professor Clover they are unbreakable. Naruto made a small sound to tell her he understood and turned his attention to the room he saw through the small gap in the wall. He saw all the professors standing there with a whiteboard next to Clover. He seemed to be explaining something to them or discussing. He didn't know which one it was, but it seemed important. Half of what they said he didn't understand, but it looked like they couldn't figure something out. Robin seemed to understand it though. Nay Robin, what are they talking about? I don't follow. She continued to listen until Professor Clover was finished and turned to him. Well, they can't figure out why what the poneglyph says isn't making any sense. The encrypting system seems to need a key and they don't know what or where it is. Naruto tilted his head in confusion. Encrypting key? He looked at her questioningly before she continued. Yes, some codes need some kind of key before they can be solved. That is why some codes and encryptions haven't been solved yet. An encrypting key can be anything, information, a number or even something personal. Naruto nodded and they turned back, but soon he drifted off again and found himself looking at the ducks before an idea popped in his head. Hey Robin, I know spot where we can look at the room better and hear better. I mean I can see it from here but I bet you can't, right? She looked at him and nodded. She couldn't see as well as he could. Well, he was half fox so he would have better senses, she mused. What do you have in mind? He showed her his famous foxy smile before gesturing for her to follow him. Minutes later they were in the ducts listening to the discussions the professors were having in the room. This doesn't make any sense. All of the information we have fits but the poneglyphs tell us otherwise. One guy shouted. The poneglyphs are the only information that we know is actually from that period, so why are they all overlapping and not forming one whole? Another guy called out. They were all murmuring and shouting until Professor Clover finally had enough. Quiet down, calm down everyone. If we don't approach this patiently we won't get anywhere. We'll need to start over and make sure we haven't missed anything. We can read it and if there is an encryption key there has to be a clue as to where it might be. They watched the professors walk out of the room, though they returned a couple of minutes later with a huge black rock. It had some kind of lettering engraved onto it. The rock was huge and it looked to be made of some sort of obsidian. They were pulling it while it was on some kind of cart. He turned to Robin and saw her looking excitedly at the stone. He turned back to it and looked at it. Before they could do anything else though, the ducks suddenly gave way and they were sent tumbling into the room. Robin, Naruto, what are you doing here? We told you not to be here, and Robin, we explicitly warned you not to be here. Professor Clover shouted. Robin was trying to seem smaller as she knew she shouldn't be there, but her curiosity got the best of her. Please Professor, I really want to help you guys and it's really interesting and, she hesitated a bit before continuing, and I can read poneglyphs, so can't I please help? Every single person in the room gasped and it soon became so quiet that a needle could be heard dropping. Robin, can you really read poneglyphs? I thought I told you it was forbidden. Besides. But before he could continue Naruto pulled the attention to him. It's wrong, he said staring at the poneglyph. Everyone in the room turned to the young boy. Professor Clover walked to Naruto and looked at him before gasping slightly. His eyes were blood red and it was as he wasn't entirely conscious. He almost seemed to be in some sort of trance. Quickly composing himself he ducked and put both hands on the boy's shoulders before looking at Naruto. What is wrong? Everyone was a bit surprised that he wasn't yelling at the boy. They knew how he was trying to keep them away from the poneglyph business, but as soon as they saw the boy's eyes they knew something was wrong and continued watching without interrupting. The encryptions are wrong. As soon as he said that he walked to the poneglyph and held his hand up to touch it. As the hand brushed the black stone it started glowing an odd color red and the encryptions started coming alive. They left the stone swimming across the room. Everyone was quiet, some scared and some intrigued but all of them surprised. All the encryptions were rearranging themselves and were slowly being placed back onto the poneglyph. One by one the encryptions were placed in the order Naruto wanted them, and as soon as every single one of them was back on the black stone, he took a step back. As the black stone stopped glowing Naruto's eyes turned back to their normal sky-colored blue and he collapsed onto the ground. Naruto! Everyone yelled. They checked up on the boy and made sure he was alright before they slowly turned back to the poneglyph. While Professor Clover still had the young boy in his arms. He looked down the writings and the first thing that went through his mind was, it makes sense now. After that night everything took a turn from bad. Worst to worst with some good things in between. Almost immediately after Naruto woke up, Robin and he were forbidden to go to the library for a week because of disobeying the rules. They were heartbroken because even though it was only for a week, it was Robin's safe haven from the village and everything else, and the only place Naruto could relax in and enjoy. Being kicked out from it was harsh for the both of them. To make it even better, the both of them were ambushed by the kids from the village almost straight after. They threw pieces of food at, and though he could easily dodge them, Naruto was devastated from being temporarily banished from the library and worried that they might start to hate him after what had happened. He didn't entirely understand what. Hell, he didn't know for one bit what had happened, but he knew it wasn't normal for an 8-year-old to be surrounded by floating letters and rearranging them as if it were a game. He remembered knowing what to do and where to place them even though he'd never seen them before. He grabbed Robin by the hand and dragged her to the forest. As soon as they got there, he turned around and made her look him in the eye. "Nay, Robin," he continued after she nodded, showing he had her attention. "Don't worry, it's only 1 week. They'll forgive us and we can lay off the poneglyph for a while, you'll see. And when we're older we can help them and they can't stop us then." He grinned at her, trying to show her it was fine. She giggled for a bit and then turned to face him. "Thanks, Naruto, but if you want to reassure me you'll need to make sure your smile is real." She smirked when she saw him pout. She moved closer to him and gave him a hug. "Thanks, Naruto, I really appreciate it." She moved away and sat down next to him. "You know, if it was a month ago that this happened, I would have been devastated, but now. Oh, don't get me wrong, I feel awful about what happened, but I have you here with me." She looked him in the eyes and gave him her best smile yet. "And I feel like I can go anywhere as long as I'm with you." He returned the smile and they stood up. "Nay, Naruto, can I pet you?" She tried to hide her face, but Naruto saw the blush spreading on it and smirked. "Hey, developed a fox fetish, Robin?" he asked sarcastically. He laughed as he saw her turn from slightly red to a full-blown out tomato-colored red. "Well, I don't mind." He did a backward flip and after a flash of light a beautiful yellow fox stood by her side at waist height. They moved towards the forest and when they reached the beach they sat down again. She started reading while petting Naruto and he lied down enjoying it and having a nap. After an hour or so though, Naruto was awoken by a huge noise and he immediately took a defensive position in front of Robin. He looked around and tried to pinpoint the location. He felt Robin hiding slightly behind him as he continued to search but couldn't find anything. Boom! He jumped slightly in surprise but held his ground. Robin did the same, which Naruto thought was brave for someone her age and not trained. He quickly transformed back and grabbed her hand. "Wah! Naruto, what are you doing?" He ran towards the sound quietly and looked back to Robin. "Aren't you curious about what's there?" She nodded. "Yes, I am. But what if it's something dangerous?" He could see the worry in her eyes. "Well, then I'll just have to protect you from, won't I?" She looked hesitant, but after he showed her his usual foxy smile she relented. "Okay, but if it's anything dangerous we leave." Hi, Robin-sama." She looked at him with a pointed look and he agreed. They moved silently through the forest towards where they thought all the crushing and whamming sounds came from. Without making a sound they came closer and closer, slowly reaching the beach on the other side of the island. Naruto wanted to use the trees as a way of camouflage and to be sure they weren't seen, but Robin couldn't do this. She wasn't a shinobi after all, so they had to walk slowly to be quiet. Although it was slower they had to be careful, so they made their way towards the sound. He had been expecting all kinds of things when they heard the sound. It was a very loud sound and if it hadn't been from so deep inside the forest Naruto could have sworn the village would have heard it. So he knew it couldn't be anything normal. After all, what normal thing made that kind of noise? But it just made him more excited about what it was. After walking through the forest for a couple of minutes, the sound became more quiet and they had to concentrate to find them, although Naruto didn't have much of a problem listening to it. They slowly reached the beach, but what they saw wasn't what they had been expecting. Laying half on the beach was a giant. Naruto was amazed and tried to move closer. He wasn't the only one. Robin couldn't hide her curiosity and followed him to the giant. They were surprised to see that those sounds were of him coughing loudly from swallowing seawater. They walked around him as he lay there quietly without moving. Naruto knew from years of training that the giant was awake, but he didn't know why he would pretend otherwise, so he tried to take the lead, but Robin stayed next to him. He heard something move and stayed defensively by Robin's side. "Gwa!" The giant suddenly yelled, but Naruto and Robin both just stared at him. That giant definitely has to do some training if he wants to scare someone, Naruto thought. He looked to Robin and saw she was also looking at him as if he were crazy. Surprisingly, though he didn't see the usual spark in her eyes that she had when something interested her, was a giant not interesting enough for her? But before they could do anything the giant collapsed before them. "Am I Mizu?" He looked at Robin as she repeated it. "Mimizu?" Before Naruto started laughing. "Mizu, Robin, I think he wants water." She blushed slightly and turned away. "I knew that." He continued laughing but walked towards the giant. "Nay, Oji-san." There's a river just up ahead in the forest, but we can't carry you there. Can you walk? The giant looked up slightly and nodded before moving toward the direction Naruto pointed him in. H. After the giant had some water to drink, he sat down next to the river while Naruto and Robin were sitting down in a giant rock next to him, so they could at least see his face. Ya spared Mu life. I wonder if that person's alright too. That person, Naruto thought as they listened. They didn't interrupt him as he turned to them. Dis land got a town, no? Robin looked at me before answering. Yup. The giant sighed. I wish Ad drifted to Suma place uninhabited. But before they could ask anything about it, he adjusted his position, causing them lose their balance and falling over slightly. They quickly found their balance and sat down again. After waiting for a while, Robin got her book out and started reading. Naruto was taking a nap while keeping an eye out for the giant. The giant in particular was thinking about something. After half an hour or so passed, he finally decided to speak again. Nothing'll happen if you stay ere ya no. Ah hurt my legs, so I'll just be sitting ere, I'll probably and make a raft eventually. Robin nodded while he just looked at the giant, slightly bored. The giant looked at them and put on a serious expression. Is this ya first time seeing a giant? He and Robin both nodded before he continued. Well, lemme tell ya guys, don't think of me as dos barbaric, elbaf. It bothers me dat they are very well known, people'll think all giants are like 'em. Naruto just nodded while Robin replied, I see. The giant continued. Well, even if ya say no, I'll ask anyway. Wow'd ya please not tell anybody 'bout me? We both nodded, but he just shook his head. Ya answered too quick. Ya gonna tell, aren't ya? No way a child can keep a secret. Naruto was about to tell him something, but Robin beat him to it. Dad, I'm not interested in you. Naruto's sweat dropped while the giant started laughing. Dereshishishis. What was that? Naruto said for the first time. The giant turned to him. What just laughing? Dereshishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishishish the ground having problems breathing. I'm Jaguar D. Saul. You two are? D? Robin asked, seeing the similarity to Naruto's name. Oh, that's always been in ma family. Robin made a hem sound. What's her name? She looked to Naruto as he nodded. I'm Robin and he's Naruto, she said while pointing my way. You're Oshikyu? Naruto said, giving him his foxy smile. Saul seemed to think about something while looking at them before shaking his head. Nah, that can't be, he said to himself, but not before Naruto heard it and looked up, but decided he could ask later when Saul continued. Nice to meet up, y'all, you two. Naruto smiled and Robin nodded to him. Y'all really won't tell anyone? They both nodded before Naruto answered. It's not like we have anyone to tell anyway. Saul looked at them slightly shocked. What y'all mean? Robin looked to Naruto and he nodded, showing it was okay for her to talk about him too. Well, I don't have any parents to tell something to. Well, I have a mom, but she left for the sea when I was young, so I don't remember her, and Naruto washed up on this island, so it's the same for him. The only ones we could and would tell are the archaeologists here, but we were just chased from the library for a week, so that's not an option either. Saul just looked sadly at them as she talked. But couldn't y'all just tell someone from the village? Naruto saw Robin hesitate for a moment before talking. No, I can't and won't. The kids in town say I'm creepy and won't play or talk to me, she said as she waved her arms, making a row of hands sprout on Saul's arm. He didn't look surprised though. Y'all a devil fruit user? Robin looked up at him in surprise. Aren't you scared? He laughed again before answering. Nah. I have seen plenty of 'em on da sea. She smiled for a bit. So I think it's getting dark. Robin, shouldn't you be returning to your house before Roji gets mad? Naruto said, saying the name Roji with disgust. She turned to him and nodded. Well then, I'll see you tomorrow, Naruto, and I hope I'll see you again soon, Saul. Saul laughed and waved her goodbye. Me too, Robin. Slowly she moved out of sight and Naruto stood up. Shouldn't ya be going home too? Saul asked him. Nah, Robin told you, didn't she? I washed up here about a month ago. I live in the forest. Saul looked at him with wide eyes before they returned to their normal size. Well then I guess we're neighbors. Yeah, I guess we are. Naruto walked to the side of the stone and jumped from it to a nearby branch, jumping from branch to branch until he reached the ground. After he did this, he went to take a drink at the river, ignoring the giant that was looking astonished at him. What the hell was that? Naruto finished drinking and turned to him. What was what? Saul pointed to the rock and trees he just jumped of, and Naruto realized what he meant. Ooh, that. I'm trained to do that, so I've got much better reflexes and my body is much stronger than most people. He smiled in a way that looked slightly forced, and Saul seemed like he wanted to ask something but decided against it. Naruto stood up and brushed off the mud of his clothes. Well, It was nice meeting you, Saul, but I have got to go hunt now, otherwise I won't have any food for tonight, Naruto said as he left to enter the forest. Once out of sight he changed to his fox form and started hunting, but not before he had heard a last sentence from the giant. If ya done ya welcome ta join me. Ooh, Professor Clover. A man ran towards the clover-haired professor. What is it? He answered and turned around to face the younger man. Sir, we have finished decrypting the stone entirely, and he took a deep breath and continued. Everything makes sense now. The information fits exactly with all the other decrypted stones we have found. It seems whatever Naruto did, it was exactly what was needed to decrypt the stone. We have hypothesized that the other stones we have studied had been decrypted in a similar way. Clover listened to the man in front of him as he explained what was written on the stone. Something Naruto did was the encryption key. No, Naruto only touched it slightly. All of the other professors and archaeologists have done that before. But it wasn't something that Naruto, why did the poneglyph react like it did? Maybe, he gasped as he realized something. Professor, is something wrong? Clover muttered something. What? Naruto is an encryption key, but how is that possible? The younger man stared in shock at what the professor had just said, but before he could ask anything else the professor turned to him. You. Call for a meeting. All the archaeologists and professor of the Tree of Knowledge are to be present. This must be discussed before Olvia returns next week. The younger man nodded and turned away to get it done. Professor Clover turned to the poneglyph and sighed. This was going to get very difficult. A girl who can read poneglyphs and a boy who can decrypt them. He just hoped they would both be safe. It had been a week since Naruto and Robin had found Saul on the beach, and they had visited him every day since. He told them stories about giants and of his adventures on the sea. Robin had told him about herself and the island. When she had told him how they were still pretty much alone despite being surrounded by the villagers, Saul had given her some advice. Nobody is born alone in this world. Somewhere there are nakama that will protect you and stay by your side. When he said that, Naruto agreed and told her he would always be with her. She had smiled and told him she would be there for him too. Saul had started to laugh after that, and soon everyone was laughing again. They were happy. The banishment from the library had been officially lifted. They had made a new friend and everything was going well. But that would all change today. That was how Naruto felt when he woke up that morning. He shook off the feeling, not believing it, and went to meet Robin at the library where they had planned to meet. He ran through the forest and soon he saw Robin standing in front of the Tree of Knowledge waiting for him. Hey Robin. She turned around and smiled at him. He moved closer until he was standing next to her. Hey Naruto. He smiled at her. Today we're finally allowed back in. You know our promise, right? She looked down a bit sadly. Yeah, no bothering them about poneglyph until we're a bit older. Yeah, I know you want to, but getting permanently banished from the library isn't going to help, and you know Saul is going to leave soon. Yes, Saul was going to leave soon, as his wound had nearly healed and he was nearly done making his raft to leave for the next island. She nodded. Well then let's go in. She nodded again and knocked on the door. Soon the door opened and Professor Clover stood there. He looked down at us. Well, it seems the week has passed, and what have you two learned from this? Robin shuffled a bit and Naruto noticed he was doing the same. It was strange, he had been yelled at plenty of times, but it was different when Professor Clover did it. He actually cared what the professor thought of him, and so he didn't like it when they looked at them as if they were disappointed. Robin was the first to answer. Sir, I understand we're too young to join you in your research and we won't try to sneak in anymore. He looked at her with a smile and relief, but Naruto knew she wasn't done yet. But Clover was surprised but continued listening as Robin looked determined to. I will study poneglyphs when I am old enough. I want to study them just like my mother, and I can because I can read them. If you say we are too young to help, then we will wait a couple of years, but we will help when we are old enough to. Clover sighed as he knew there was nothing he could do against it. We? He asked. She nodded. Yes, Naruto had decided to help me in any way he can, and I will help him with his goals. Clover looked to Naruto. Your goals? Naruto nodded. Yes, I want to become strong. Strong enough to protect those precious to me and not let anything happen to them. Clover looked into his sky blue eyes and saw the determination of the both of them. Very well, I don't think I could stop you two, but as I said, not until you are officially adults, as this is forbidden and you two are too young. Now I wanted to tell you two earlier, but we have some very important thing to talk about today, so I hope you'll come back here later in the evening. They were disappointed but slowly agreed and left the tree to go to the beach. Later on the beach, Naruto and Robin were talking to Saul again. He was listening to Robin as she talked to Saul about her dream of following her mother when she returned. Hey, y'all an archaeologist, even though we're so little. Naruto laughed at that as he had the same reaction. Robin pouted for a while but quickly continued. Yes, and though I don't remember my mom, I know she is busy with her archaeology research, so next time she comes home I'm going to show her that I'm an archaeologist and ask her to take me with her. She smiled slightly at the idea and Naruto followed up. Yeah, and I'm going to follow her, and if I'm not allowed I'll sneak onto the boat and prank everyone there. They all burst out in laughing, Naruto and Robin laughing normally and Saul doing his famous, Dereshi Shishi, laugh. Nay Saul, did you know that there is a period in history where nobody knows what happened? Saul nodded. Yeah, da void of 100 years, right? Robin nodded and continued. Yeah, I find it really interesting, but the government forbids any research of it. Naruto saw where this was heading and tried to intervene. Nay Robin, you sure you want to tell this to Saul? Not that I don't trust him, but... He trailed of seeing her determined eyes looking at him. He paused and knew that if she had thought it through, why interfere? So she continued, my mom is studying this. He saw Saul's eyes wide and his mouth opened and closed as if trying to say something, but he tried to calm down. After a couple of minutes of seeing Saul trying to get his breathing under control, he turned to the kids. Ya mom is looking for them poneglyphs? He said, still looking surprised. Robin was also surprised, but for a different reason. You know about poneglyphs? Well yeah, only dem who have studied it can read it, and even dem they haven't found da right way to read da poneglyphs yet. She smiled at him as him knowing it made it easier for them to explain. Yeah, but I can read poneglyph and... She looked at Naruto and he nodded, and it seems Naruto knows how to solve the encryption so... But before she could continue, Saul had started panicking and murmuring to himself. He and Robin watched him panic and stayed quiet. After several minutes he turned to them with a very panicked expression. Nah, ya too is da true what ya just said. They both nodded hesitantly. Then ya can't say anything about dat, okay? It's very dangerous, ya can get killed for dat. He and Robin both stayed quiet listening to what Saul was telling them. Robin, Naruto, what are ya mother's name? They switched glances and Robin answered first, Nico Olvia. They saw his eyes widen with recognition before Naruto answered, Uzumaki D. Kashina. And that did it. Saul started laughing, but not his usual jolly and happy laugh. This laugh was filled with hurt, regret and sadness. Naruto wanted to ask what was wrong, he saw Robin wanted to too, but they waited for him to calm down. Dereshishishi, what a twist. The children of two friends meet. Naruto and Robin's eyes widened as they glanced at each other. They both turned back to Saul soon after with Naruto asking what they both thought. What do you mean? I mean dat ya mothers were friends. They were bod searching for poneglyphs before it became too dangerous for ya mother ta continue and Olvia send her ta live with her lover that ah assume is ya dad. He said looking at Naruto. Naruto looked at Robin with awe before turning back to Saul. What do you mean dangerous? He said narrowing his eyes. Saul noticed this and explained. Naruto, I think ya know what I mean. That was enough for him to know Saul meant the strange thing he'd done back at the Tree of Knowledge, but he didn't understand what was so dangerous about it. I don't understand. Does this have something to do with the poneglyph? He turned to Robin and saw she was thinking about something. He also thought about it. He knew that he had never seen a poneglyph before in his life and yet he somehow knew how to decrypt them. At least that was the conclusion as to what they thought he did. It was a bit strange once he thought about it really. Saul nodded. Yeah, I don't know how but ya mum told me. Dat Kashina could just do it. They thought it had to do with Ya Fox's side. Naruto flinched slightly. He didn't like people who he hadn't told himself mention that. They said that maybe Ya were one of dear descendants who were given the key or it was just in Ya blood or something. But Da government figured it out and started hunting her. Naruto flinched again and this time Robin stayed quiet. But Naruto, why are Ya here? Aren't Ya still supposed to be where Ya mum is? Naruto looked down sadly and shook his head. No, I don't know where they are. Gigi, the one who told me about them, said he didn't know where they were. I don't even know all that much about them, pretty much only their names. I was kicked out of the village because they saw me as a threat. After being hunted for months I ran off the island and ended up here on Ohara. Saul looked down at him sadly but that didn't last long. They saw Saul's expressions change once more from one of explaining to panic. This is really Ohara, ain't it? They both nodded. Saul sighed heavily and tried to calm down. Kids, ya better listen to what I say real good, okay? What I am telling ya is real important. The reason I was stranded here was cause I left the marine to save ya mum from jail. Robin, she told me everything and that's why I knew that ya parents were friends. But we escaped because we heard that ya home was gonna be attacked by the marine for illegally researching poneglyph. Naruto watched as he saw Robin pale. Within seconds it turned to panic and she started to yell it wasn't true. He himself didn't react as much but maybe that was because it just didn't feel real to him. All the peace the last month had made him gone soft. He just wasn't as prepared and now he was going to pay for it. After Saul shouted that he wouldn't lie to them and that Robin's mom might be back, she ran away as fast as she could towards the Tree of Knowledge. Naruto sat there for a while in silence before he turned back to Saul. Saul, when will the marine get here? But before he could get an answer they heard an explosion from the village. Naruto didn't wait. I think I got my answer. Saul. Arigato, I'll see you later. But before the giant could answer, Naruto had vanished with a blur of yellow. Ooh. Nico Olvia. A young archaeologist said, pointing towards the doorway. In the doorway a young woman was standing. She had snow-white hair and had features that weren't unlike an older version of Robin. She was wearing a sky-blue t-shirt with some brown pants that were easy to move in and had lots of pocket. Over it all she was wearing a long white trench coat, not unlike a lab coat, but it was a bit battered and seemed old. The woman walked into the Tree of Knowledge and was welcomed from all sides by everyone. Professor Clover stepped forward from the back of the group and gave her a hand. It's nice to see you again. We haven't seen you or had contact since you came here to drop Robin off. The woman named Olvia smiled sadly and gave the professor a firm hand. Sorry Professor Clover, a lot has happened, but I have some serious information that I need to tell you now. Clover was a bit taken aback but motioned for her to come in further and sit down, but she waved it off and asked if she'd tell it there and then. As I've told you, I have some bad news. The government has officially set their sights on us. Everyone in the room gasped, but not many were actually surprised. They had expected this to happen eventually. I take it you've read the newspaper, but the expedition group that left 6 years ago were all killed and I am the only survivor. I escaped to tell you that this island will be attacked and you all have to escape before it is too late. She yelled the last bit as all the archaeologists in the room seemed to slowly calm down. The slight shock that had been there had disappeared and the archaeologists seemed almost apathetic to what was happening around them. One might even have said at peace with what was happening. Slowly shaking their heads, they showed Olvia that it wasn't going to turn out like she'd hoped it would. Why won't you leave? Staying here is forfeiting your life. She said, panicking even more, but the archaeologists wouldn't budge. You're right, this time, it seems, we can no longer elude the eyes of our investigators. If the government is trying to kill us. Olvia tried to cut in as she knew what was coming, but Clover continued, but Olvia, we cannot run away, abandoning all these treasures of mankind, he said as he waved around the tree, showing all the books the tree held. You should have known that, Olvia. The woman in question looked down in frustration but eventually relented. Then I will join you. A majority of the archaeologists tried to oppose, saying that Olvia had a daughter to take care of and that she should go see her. But she wouldn't agree. She didn't deserve Robin after leaving her in the first place. Professor, how is Robin doing? She looked at him waiting for the answer. He sighed and gave her a big proud smile. She is well. She has the same love for archaeology that you have and frankly is a genius at it too. She isn't treated well at this island and was always alone, but in the last month she made friends with a boy who washed ashore here and they have been inseparable since. This made Olvia smile and remember her own encounter with Kushina. If Robin was all right, then that was good. A boy that washed ashore? She asked, just as curious as Robin had been. The professor nodded. Yes, she found him on the beach and they became friends. He came here the next day looking for her and since they've been coming here every day except for last week. His name was Naruto. Uzumaki D. Naruto. It sounds familiar, doesn't it? Olvia had wanted to ask about why they hadn't come in the last week, but after hearing that name she froze. It couldn't really be that Uzumaki D, right? But before she could think any further about that, they heard an explosion close to the village and ran out of the tree to get a better look. Everyone remember, you are neither acquaintances nor nakama of mine. Olvia yelled as she ran towards the village, not listening to any of the scholars telling her to come back. She ran through the village towards the ships with a gun in her hands. People in the village were panicking. She continued all the way to Bay without noticing Robin running past her towards the Tree of Knowledge. Naruto had quickly caught up with Robin as she was running towards the Tree of Knowledge. He could see she was panicking but couldn't tell her to calm down. After all, he was just as worried himself. Naruto knew he could fight if he had to and he would be able to protect Robin, but he wasn't sure what to do if there were a lot of people or if they decided to attack the island. Naruto knew he was quite strong, but he was only 8, he didn't have the experience or the power to handle an entire army. Running next to Robin, he could see the Tree of Knowledge coming into sight. Before Naruto could do or say anything, Robin stormed into the tree. Professor! Professor! Everyone who was there turned around to face the little girl. Naruto stood behind her, leaning against the wall next to the door. Robin, Naruto. What are you doing here? I thought I told not to. But before he could continue, Robin cut him off. Did my mother come here? She was still breathing heavily from running all the way to the tree and she was rather excited but scared at the same time. He could understand. Having the chance to meet your mother again, but doing so while everyone is in danger could cause a lot mixed feelings. Robin. What are you saying? Of course not. They were obviously lying. Everyone was shocked to know she was there and they were clearly averting their eyes from her. Robin looked disappointed though, so she probably hadn't noticed it. She didn't let it get her down though and immediately addressed the next problem. Oh, but Professor, you have to get away from here. The government is coming here to arrest all of you. Once more the scholars were shocked, but more about the fact that Robin knew about it than the fact they were going to be arrested. Robin, how did you? No, Robin, once they come here you can't tell them you're an archaeologist or that you can read poneglyph, okay? He gave Robin a stern look until she nodded hesitantly. The man breathed a satisfied sigh of relief before turning to Naruto. He tensed slightly but held his ground as that stern look turned his way. Naruto, don't tell them anything about being involved with us on this island, okay? It's for your own safety. He desperately wanted to disagree, but he got the same look as Robin. In the end he couldn't keep it up and turned away, nodding slightly. A strong feeling of anticipation churned in his stomach, and it wasn't the good kind. It hadn't even been minutes after having agreed to the stern look and soldiers barged into the Tree of Knowledge. In an orderly fashion they started apprehending the archaeologists. It took Naruto everything he had not to start yelling at them for doing so. You are all suspected of doing forbidden research on poneglyphs. Resist and we will be forced to use violence. Guns were held up, pointed towards every adult in the room. All of the scholars listened and they were each taken outside slowly. Naruto and Robin had to follow them but were not cuffed because they were children and at the least not suspected of being involved in their research. Soon after everyone was gathered outside, the soldiers entered the tree and started to throw books on the ground under the guise of searching for evidence. All of the scholars tried to stay calm, but some could not handle it and yelled for them to stop ravaging the books and precious pieces of history. Naruto clenched his hands until blood poured out, trying not to interfere. He knew he would make things worse, but he felt the burning need to help. Slowly he felt something slide into his hands and looked up to see Robin holding his hand with the same expression. She was scared. Scared of what might happen to them, but mostly of what might happen to the rest of their friends. We found it. Naruto's blood ran cold and he hoped it wasn't what he thought. We found the poneglyph. Everything seemed to almost slow down in an agonizing slow pace. It felt as if his heart stopped. If they found the poneglyph there would be no way for them to prove they weren't studying it. For a moment he thought it couldn't get any worse, but he was soon proven wrong as a loud voice cut through the air in his numb state of mind. Haha, good work. Ore-sama Spandine captured the person who was the cause of everything. A man exclaimed while laughing in a ridiculously manner as he threw the woman, whom he was holding by the hair roughly, onto the ground. Now as we have proof of you doing forbidden research on this island, I can officially tell you, you are all to be executed. Wahanaha. Naruto and Robin looked at the man with disgust. The guy seemed to love making people suffer, and that poor woman was very beat up. Before anything else could happen, Professor Clover stood up. He had a resolute look in his eyes, determined to do something. I request to speak with the heads of the world, the Gorosei, before we are executed. We have a hypothesis on the void of 100 years. Spandine thought about it for a moment before agreeing with a snort. He motioned for the men to pick up the woman, but before they could she forced herself to stand up and follow them, looking in their direction. They were getting ready for what was going to happen, but Naruto could see Robin tearing up and shaking. She was scared, and when he looked at his own hands he saw the same. He was scared of losing more of the people he cared about and of being unable to save them. If it came to it he would probably attack. He started to get ready, but before Robin and Naruto could even try to do anything. Robin, Naruto, they turned to see Professor Clover. Get away from here, they are putting up an evacuation boat down by the village. You two have nothing to do with us. They started to argue as neither wanted to leave. No. You both have to get away from here. If you hear my story you will become sinners. The man was firm on this as Clover turned to Spandine with a fierce look. The other man, who with the smallest amount of common sense he had, motioned for some soldiers to take the kids away. Naruto wanted to intervene and help them but stopped when he saw all of the scholars looking at them and shaking their heads, telling them to be safe. He froze and suddenly found himself unable to disobey. He looked around and saw the woman looking at them with many emotions on her face. He wondered why she would look at them like that, but shook of the thought. They were slowly taken away, but as soon as they were outside Naruto pressed a pressure point on the arm that was holding him, and as soon as he was released he ducked and stuck out his leg, tripping the man. He jumped up and dodged a quick attack from the man that was holding Robin, but because he was holding on to someone else he couldn't make any fast movements, and Naruto hit him on the back of his neck on the nerves, rendering him unconscious. Soon after the man he had tripped stood up and charged at Naruto. The man tried to hit him in the face. Thinking he had Naruto cornered after he had fallen down, the man let his guard down. Naruto though noticed this and used his speed to get behind the man and kicked him in between his shoulder blades, rendering him unconscious. The man had hardly noticed the boy move and regretted letting down his guard. Naruto brushed the invisible dirt of his clothes and held out his hand to help Robin up. She took his hand and looked at the men in awe. Wow, Naruto, you're really strong. I knew you were, but I've never seen you actually fight. He blushed and smiled sheepishly before returning to a serious expression. Robin doing the same. They stood up and walked to the corner of the building they were behind and started to peep on the discussion. ready to burst in and help the professor and the rest if they needed help. Ooh, Naruto. Robin. She looked up as she hears Professor Clover scream those names. She saw Robin standing there with Naruto standing next to her. She could finally see her daughter, but she could never tell her. She would never make her live her life as the daughter of a criminal. She saw them being carried off by the soldiers. The thing that she really wanted to do right that moment was to run to Robin and give her a big hug, tell her how much Olvia missed her and wanted to take her away from here. After that she wanted to walk up to Naruto and ask him what happened to her best friend, but she knew that chance wouldn't come. She felt something cold touch her hands. Looking down she realized she was crying slightly. She didn't care though. She continued looking toward the children but noticed that Naruto was staring at her. She looked at the little boy and realized he didn't look that well. Both of them didn't look that well. The both of them were thin and small. She didn't know how old Naruto was exactly, but she knew Robin should be taller than she was. They also had very old clothes. Naruto was wearing some shorts that had holes in them. You couldn't see them immediately, but if you continued looking you'd see that every bit of cloth on his body was worn. He didn't seem to care though. He was also wearing a blue shirt. And well, it was probably a blue shirt now, it was kind of grayish. She turned slightly to see Robin better. She was wearing a purple dress that looked clean, but just as with Naruto you could see it was worn and getting dirty. She wondered what kind of life they had had until now. She felt slightly guilty, but knew that they had to continue their study. If she could she would make it up to them, but otherwise she would make sure they left here alive. Robin and Naruto were peeking from behind the wall and listening in on the conversation. Naruto had heard that they would be sinners if they heard, but if nobody knew they had listened in on them it wouldn't matter. And Robin seemed to want to listen no matter what, and he had decided to protect her and stay by her side. He got a bit sad when he thought about his old home but shook his head and turned his attention back to the clearing where Professor Clover was talking. Ooh, the rudeness. Bastard, you're talking to the leaders of the world here, he heard Spandine scream. If what was happening wasn't so serious, Naruto knew he would have burst into laughter. Nay Robin. Why is the old guy so hysteric? She seemed incredulous at the fact that he hadn't been listening at all. Well, Professor Clover apparently insulted the people on the phone, but I can't hear what they are saying over the phone. Naruto nodded and concentrated on his ears. He could faintly hear what they were saying and told Robin every bit he heard, while she explained some of the things he didn't understand. If you read the poneglyphs, the revival of the ancient weapons will bring about a crisis for the world. Even if you bear no ill will, there may be other who will use them in such a fashion. The man on the other side of the phone said, but before he could continue he was interrupted by Professor Clover. No matter what lies in the past, humans create history and thus they must accept that. If we come to know things without feeling fear, we may be able to create some form of countermeasure. That is mere idealism, Professor Clover. Is that so? I think you were saying you can't because it's not convenient for you to accept this. The guy on the phone stayed silent, so Professor Clover continued. Nowadays the truth we wish to know most is, to know the poneglyphs' reason for existence opposed to their contents. In the past, why would people use text on mineral ore? Perhaps they wished to convey something to the future. If they etched history onto broken up stones and spread them throughout the world, they probably couldn't leave behind paper or books, because they may have thought that their message would get destroyed, correct? In other words, there is clear evidence the people that left behind the stone had an enemy. What is it you wish to say, Professor Clover? Naruto noticed the voice on the other side sounded slightly nervous. Normal people would probably have missed. Heck, even he wasn't sure he heard it. If we assume that these people were destroyed by their enemy, then their enemy would continue to live on in history. This may seem unexpected, but 800 years ago, right after the 100 years of blank pages, the world government was born. Naruto could hear the person on the other side of the telephone gasp slightly, but Professor Clover continued. If the destroyed people's enemy had become the world government, then I believe that the 100 years of blank pages were erased by the world government's hands as inconvenient history. When we read the texts about the distant past on the poneglyphs, we learn of the existence of a single country. One of which there is now no trace of, but what we determined from the texts was a great civilization. At one point, they seemed to boast having great power, but at this point any information about this country has been thoroughly erased. Most likely they may have come to understand that they would be defeated by the alliance of nations that would later come to be named as the world government, and so they entrusted that knowledge to the future by carving the whole truth into stones, the stones which we now know as poneglyphs. I see. That is an audacious hypothesis, Professor. Professor Clover seemed unaffected by the comment and continued on. The ancient weapons are truly a threat to the world. However, the greater threat to the government would be revealing the history, ideas, and even the existence of that country. The power that they had. After all, nobody but her had been able to decipher what was on the stones. And though I am unable to fully explain that threat until all the mysteries have been unraveled. However, the name of that country was... Bang! Naruto and Robin watched as the professor's body slowly collapsed. He could hear Robin scream next to him and run to the professor. He himself made a move to follow, but before he could even move he heard the sentence that made him snap. Ohara knows too much, don't let a single person get away. And before he knew it, Naruto was running full speed towards the clearing. Not even seconds later he arrived in a yellow blur and started knocking all of the soldiers unconscious. He was lucky they were all untrained rookies who barely knew how to hold a gun. While Naruto was taking down all of the soldiers in his rage, Robin was sitting next to the professor as he drew his last breath. She screamed and cried for him to stay, but he didn't take notice and just started to speak to her. "Robin, you shouldn't be here. Where is Naruto?" She sniffed and tried to wipe away her tears. "He got mad after seeing you shot and is fighting the soldiers." His eyes widened and he tried to see where the kid was, but he hadn't the strength left for it. "Robin, you have to stop Naruto. If you get him to stop, you might still be allowed to go to the refugee ship." She shook her head and started crying more. "Robin, listen to me, if you don't stop Naruto now he'll be in a whole lot of trouble." She nodded and slowly stood up before walking to where she saw Naruto fighting. While Robin was walking towards Naruto, Spandine saw the kid take down 10 of his adult soldiers. "That kid is a monster, gotta do this quickly." He took out a golden-colored snail and pressed the button on top with a smirk. "Buster call time." The scholars close to him briefly wondered what he did. "Naruto." He stopped after he heard Robin scream and saw her crying. He ran to her and gave her a hug before noticing he himself was also crying. They sat down and let their tears pour. Slowly the comfort they brought one another took over. Tears were reduced to mere shakes and the panic receded. "Are you all right now?" Robin asked him. Naruto nodded and they stood up. They tried to walk back to Professor Clover, but that Spandine guy stood between them. Naruto moved a step in front of Robin to protect her and glared at the man who had caused all this trouble. Now that was quite the show you showed us there, boy. Why don't you tell me how you took down 10 grown men when you yourself are only what? 6. The arrogant man asked, smirking widely. What he didn't notice was the growing tick mark on Naruto's forehead as he continued. "I mean, seriously, do you have a weapon hidden somewhere? You better answer me, Brad, before I kick you back to your mommy." That was the last straw. Naruto glared at him so fiercely that if looks could kill he would have been dead a million times over. That wasn't what had scared Spandine scared though. Despite the cowardly acts the man had involved him, he was ultimately a Marine. No, what had scared the man was something entirely different. Naruto felt the rage build inside him and was having trouble containing it. But he hadn't noticed his eyes had turned a bloody red with slit pupils. Someone else had though. "Monster! Ah, don't kill me!" Spandine screamed as he cowardly ran to the other side of the clearing. The same place the woman still was. Naruto took a couple of breaths and tried to calm down, his eyes slowly turning back to their normal sky blue. Only a few red spots remaining. Spandine, who had arrived on the other side of the clearing, ordered his man to disperse and take the woman with them. The man didn't want anything more to do with these little demons. Of course, this little decision had not gone unnoticed by Robin. Spandine dragged the woman harshly behind him. The woman though looked Robin in the eyes for a couple of seconds. Just as quickly she averted her eyes again, but not before Robin felt something familiar. She couldn't place the feeling, but she recognized it. Before she even consciously thought about what to say, she blurted out the first thought on her mind. "Are you my mother?" The woman stopped for a moment and turned. Both Naruto and Robin saw the recognition in her eyes, but it disappeared as quickly as it came when Spandine laughed. "Haha. You have a daughter? That's hilarious." Naruto clenched his hands so as not to kick the guy down the gutter. This was important to Robin, so he would remain where he was. "No, I think you have the wrong person," the woman said, but he could see some of the tears streaming down her face and all the sympathizing faces of the scholars. That woman was Robin's mother and was trying to protect her. Even after all these years. Robin didn't want to give up though. This woman had to be her mother, that sense of familiarity and comfort. She tried to hold back the burning feeling in her eyes and clenched her hands in the same manner as Naruto had done. "I'm Robin. Even though I'm a lot bigger, do you really not remember me? I always waited for you to come back. Are you really not my mother? I spent all my time studying. I became an archaeologist. I can read poneglyphs, and together with Naruto we can decrypt and read them." Naruto slapped himself at that. She really shouldn't have said that, but he knew this was important to her. He heard Spandine yell something like, "Those kids can decipher and read poneglyphs together?" So he took a defensive position next to her and waited for her to finish. He wouldn't let that jerk ruin this moment. "So can we please be together? I don't want to be without a family anymore," she yelled. At this point the woman couldn't take it anymore and dropped on her knees. Tears were now freely rolling down her cheeks and dropping onto the grass. There was a moment of anticipation, but before anything else could be said, bombs were shot all over the island. The tree of knowledge was hit too, and the scholars started to panic. They scrambled to save anything that they could reach in the tree, throwing it into the lake next to it. Naruto reached for Robin's shoulder, shaking it slightly. She turned to face him and he nodded briefly in Olvia's direction. She smiled gratefully and nodded before turning back to the woman and running towards her. Naruto himself turned back to face Spandine in case he did anything. The man was ranting angrily. Damn, they've started the bombardment already, should have waited with the buster call until I was of the island. Spandine turned around as he was approached by someone. Sir, what should we do with the girl and the prisoner? A young soldier said as he turned to Spandine. The man though just shrugged him off and ran away screaming, leave them here, my life is more important. The men hesitated for a moment as they looked at the scene around them. Were they really doing the right thing? Many of the men didn't agree, but really, they didn't have much of a choice. Naruto watched Spandine leave with all the soldiers before walking back to where Robin was. Olvia was hugging her and Robin was crying with all her might. This time though they were tears of happiness and relief at having found her mother. He himself had to dry a few stray tears before coming to stand next to them. Robin looked up and smiled at him. Naruto, I'd like you to meet my mother. He gave her a patented wide smile before turning to Olvia. Nice to meet you, I'm Uzumaki D. Naruto. She nodded and gave him a relieved smile. I know, your face is identical to that of Kushina. Though your hair and eyes are probably from your dad. She chuckled slightly as Naruto's eyes lit up at the mention of his own parents. He gave her a foxy grin. Thanks, that's really nice to know. But before they could continue talking, Saul came running out of the forest calling for the both of them. When the shook started to shake around them in pulses, everyone looked up to Saul running towards them. Surprisingly, nobody was surprised as to why they all knew one another. Well, except for one, but that was for an entirely different reason. Saul, what are you doing here? Olvia asked, rather surprised and worried. I was shipwrecked, but more importantly, ya avenue ta get away from here. Da have warships surrounding da entire island. One sign and da'll all start blasting this island of da map. He continued to ramble on for a moment, but Olvia cut him off, not feeling the usual enjoyment as seeing her friend fumble with his words. Saul, they've already gotten the sign to start bombarding. He gave her an incredulous look that, as if wondering how she could be acting so stupid. Then why haven't ya left yet? She sighed and pointed to the tree of knowledge. A flash of understanding spread over Saul's face and quickly turned into a look of sadness. His entire posture changed to a determined yet almost resigned position. Nodding resolutely, the both of them turned back to the children standing next to them. Olvia looked down to where Robin was with a small smile. Robin, you can read poneglyphs? You must have studies hard, I'm proud of you. Nay Robin, if you want to study them you should only if you want to, okay? Robin smiled brightly while Naruto felt a pit grow in his stomach. He recognized the body language of both adults and realized what was about to happen. Before he could do anything, he was picked up and held tightly in Saul's arms. He tried to escape, but a giant's arms were quite a bit stronger, and before Naruto could decide on any possible escape routes, Saul continued and picked up Robin as well. Also realizing what was about to happen, Robin started to panic. Mom, don't go. Please take us with you. Olvia smiled at her sadly and shook her head. Gomen Robin, Naruto. I have to stay here and help the scholar collect the remaining books. I'll help treat Professor Clover. She started to turn around, but before she did so entirely she froze. Olvia looked at them one last time and the both of them could see hints of tears in her eyes as she looked at them. I hope both of you live a happy life. Saul, please take them away from here. The giant nodded and started to turn away. By this time both Naruto and Robin were panicking and tried everything they could to stop the giant from separating them. Nothing seemed to work. Saul, please take us back, please. The both of them begged and pleaded, but the giant didn't listen and continued running. Naruto could see the giant pressing his jaws together tightly in an attempt to hide the bitterness. Saul had technically known Olvia better than the both of them. Logically Naruto knew that this must hurt the giant as much as them, but at that moment, he couldn't make himself care all that much. It was all too much at the moment. Robin, who was held next to him, had tears pouring down her face. The girl was panicking in every way and only seemed to get more distraught when she realized nothing could be done. After a moment she flung herself onto Naruto's shoulder and proceeded to break down entirely, both in sadness and sorrow. Nay, did ya know? Ya mum once told me something. It's not Dad Ohara wanted ta reveal da history, they just wanted ta hear da voices of da past. History is something Dad is inherited, otherwise it is forgotten. Ya mum would want ya to always remember this place. Naruto, deep in his thought, could only faintly hear what their friend was saying. He might not have been here for long, but it was the closest he had had to a family and a real home for as long as he could remember. He cursed himself for not being strong enough to protect everyone important to him. He stared quietly towards the fire that kept spreading over the island until he could no longer see straight because of the tears making everything blurry. Next to him, Robin hadn't removed her eyes from either the sight in front of them. Yet despite all this destruction, despite all of this tragedy, Naruto couldn't get out of Saul's grip. Despite his determination to protect everyone, he couldn't muster the strength to do so. Despite his love for the island, he had no way to save it from destruction. And lastly, despite having told himself to protect Robin, he couldn't stop her tears. Holding both kids in his hands, Saul thought back about when he first met Olvia. He had been vice admiral for the Marines and was out on a mission to apprehend a boat of scholars. They were illegally researching poneglyphs, and that where he met her. His crew had killed everyone on the ship despite his orders to capture them. She had been the only one captured alive. Saul had asked her whether they wanted to create those ancient weapons so badly that they would resort to going against the law. Olvia had replied that they themselves were just scared of a past they knew nothing about. Later he found out that Admiral Sengoku had given the order to kill everyone on that ship. Saul had approached him about the scholars, and Sengoku told him they were sending someone with the authority to call on a buster call to apprehend every scholar. He figured they were just going to get rid of them and was shocked. The buster call was a very cruel method and rarely used even by those who had been given the authority to. Pressing that single button meant calling upon an entire fleet of marine battleships that destroy everything within sight. No obstacle is big enough, so long as the target is eliminated. It even went as far as to check in the aftermath. When the island has been destroyed, vice admirals will be sent to shore to finish the job against any human still alive. It was absolutely horrid. That night he went to Olvia's prison and asked for her story. She was slightly suspicious at first, but slowly she started to tell him her story. It had shocked him to the very core that the Marines were capable of something like this. It had felt as if the ground had been pulled away from beneath his feet. Without a second though, he freed her and ran away from the Marines. He could no longer obey orders when he knew they were rotten from the inside out. Saul ran on, checking his hands every now, making sure the kids were all right. He felt bad for them, but they had to live. They had hardly lived their lives yet, and he would make sure they survived. Naruto heard a brief whistle-like sound and looked up to see a cannonball that had been shot their way. His normal reaction would have been to dodge, but he could do nothing as Saul held them tightly in his hands and took the attack to his face. Saul! They both yelled, fearing for the giant. Darashishishishi, don't yaw worry, Naruto. Robin, I'm fine and I'll get yaw away from her. Never once collapsing onto the ground, Saul picked up the pace and ran towards the beach where they had first met him. When the both of them had calmed down a bit, Naruto could clearly see the danger Saul was in while doing this for them and was prepared to help in any way he could. Robin was panicking a bit but trying to keep them under control. Neither of them had noticed the tears that continued to pour from their eyes. Saul continued running and he looked like he okay, but Naruto could smell the blood that was pouring down his face and it wasn't stopping. They were quite a distance away from the village now, and the island wasn't attacked as much outside the village and the Tree of Knowledge. It was a good thing because it meant Saul wouldn't get hurt as much. Naruto cursed once more mentally. He hated being so weak, he couldn't do a thing. Here Saul was protecting them with his life and they couldn't do anything. But he was soon shaken from his thoughts as a loud voice cut through the air. Ice block partisan. Not a moment later Saul stumbled onto the ground. He kept his careful hold on the both of them and landed on his stomach with his arms stretched in front of him. Naruto could see ice creeping around Saul's feet. Kuzan, Saul said as he looked at the man standing behind him. Naruto tried to get a look at the man, but he had black glasses on, a black trench coat and a blue pirate cap. Except for his afro-like hair, there wasn't much he could actually see of the guy. My. We can't have an ex-marine interfere with the buster call, now can we? The man Kuzan spoke. He felt Saul shake and wondered if he was scared, but that thought left with the wind as he saw Saul's face. It was red with anger and frustration. Kuzan, can ya honestly be proud of dis attack? It's strange, ya should know it as well, all dis just ta create an example. Just for dat dear obliterating Ohara. If this is for the greater good of the world, then I have no opinion, they are breaking the rules after all. The thing called justice changes shape from where you stand, so I won't blame you for a different justice. But if you interfere I cannot leave you be. But as soon as those words left the man's mouth, the unspeakable happened. The refugee ship exploded after having been attacked by a marine ship. It was sinking and burning like there was no tomorrow, and for the many people on board there probably wasn't. Everyone was shocked and Saul was shaking even more than before. This is ya so-called justice. He shouted as he charged and tried to punch the man. I wasn't going to take it as far as that idiot, Kuzan said in frustration as he dodged. Saul turned around and started to run away again. I have ta get ya guys ta safety, dad is my priority. But he didn't get very far in his attempt as the giant froze up. Naruto heard the other man's voice softly from behind them. Ice time capsule. Saul let go of them and put them on the ground. Robin, Naruto. Go ya need ta get away from her. But both of them shook their heads and Naruto stood slightly in front of Robin to protect her. No, we're staying here with you, we won't leave here, Saul. He shouted with Robin behind him nodding, not trusting her own voice. No, I'm done for, but ya guys need ta get away from her. Remember Wa told ya about not being born alone, y'all find new friends and new people who'll stay by ya side. They were listening to what he said but both were shaking their heads, not wanting to listen this time, though it was Robin who spoke. Yada Saul. I don't want to leave everyone, I want to stay together, there's nothing for us across the sea. We just want to stay here. But Saul wouldn't give in and he continued. Someday both of ya will meet ya nakama. Da'll protect ya and help ya, so keep moving and don't look back. Naruto looked behind him and saw the ice slowly moving up Saul's body. It was slowly covering him until soon there would be nothing left to cover. He wanted to do something but there was nothing to be done. He didn't know any fire jutsu and he couldn't do a thing without hurting Saul's body too. Saul kept on telling them about how they had to leave before he started laughing. Dereshi. Always laugh and things'll get better. Now go Robin, Naruto. Slowly they were both moving backwards, feeling hopeless and unable to do anything as they watched their friend get covered entirely in ice. Both of ya be happy, was the last thing they heard as he was completely frozen. Robin yelled for him in panic but the giant was entirely frozen. Naruto, who clenched his teeth, realized there was nothing they could do. Honoring the giant's wish, he pulled Robin by the arm and both of them started to run away with tears pouring from their eyes. They continued running until they reached the beach where they had first met Saul. All kinds of memories came back but none that would ever happen again. They were now alone, all they had was one another. Naruto couldn't help but wonder if this would have happened if he hadn't come to this island. They kept running but soon Naruto stopped and dragged Robin behind him. He took on a defensive position in front of her. But before Robin could ask him why, she noticed the man named Kuzan sitting on the beach. Well, you were faster than I thought. Naruto looked at him fiercely while studying for a way out of the situation, but the man caught on. You're pretty amazing for a little boy, you know, sensing me form that far, taking on a fighting stance in a couple of seconds and already planning your escape. Makes me wonder what kind of life you've had until now. But anyhow, I've decided to let you go. Naruto stared at him incredulously. As if picking up on Naruto's hesitance, the man continued. Justice is a very versatile word, with many sides. You two are the legacy Saul left behind, and this time I agree with his justice. I will let you go, whether you two will seek revenge or try to live a life as normal as possible. But know that if you ever do anything wrong, I will be the first enemy to catch you too. He pointed ahead to a small boat laying on the beach. I've made a path of ice. If you follow that, you should reach the next island by tomorrow. Naruto cautiously made his way around the man, holding tightly onto Robin's hand. Both of them glared at the man, partly in hatred but also in sadness, for everything that had happened. Naruto took the boat and told Robin to get in and started pushing it into the water. They slowly floated away, but he was still on his guard for anything that could happen. As they got further and further though, they saw the island burning with everything on it. The giant tree of knowledge that had always been there had collapsed and was burning furiously. All the boats had gone to surround the front of the island, leaving them with an escape route. Both watched with tears in their eyes as their precious home slowly burned to ashes. Standing on top of the ocean was a person. He had sun-kissed blonde hair and eyes far bluer than the surrounding waters and skies. The 3 whiskers on each of his cheeks made him seem similar to a cat or maybe a fox. As the person looked out over the ocean, he seemed to notice something and turned around to run back to what looked to be a giant turtle drifting a couple of meters behind him at a leisurely pace. "RO. That storm on horizon will turn here in an hour or so, what do you want to do?" The guy asked the woman sitting on the giant turtle in her chair under a parasol. She looked up and smiled at him gently. "I guess we'll have to take shelter at Whiskey Peak and hope it passes." She ducked towards the turtle's eyes and ears before giving him a few hand signs and verbal instructions. Meanwhile, the man's face had taken to looking disgusted by her suggestion and turned to sit down on the back of the turtle. He sat close to the neck and in front of the woman's chair before facing her. But I don't want to go there, all those arrogant people there do is brag about themselves." He cried childishly. It was for a good reason though. Who'd ever want to visit Whiskey Peak willingly? The woman chuckled slightly and turned to face him. "Naruto, I know you don't like it there, but it's better to not take the chance with that storm. Besides, I have a feeling something interesting will happen there." Almost immediately after, as she said that, Naruto perked up. "Really? Well, if you say so, Robin. Your instincts are on par with mine, so I guess I'll have something to look forward to." He smiled in a manner that radiated satisfaction before laying down on his back. Robin moved to join him and soon they were sitting next to each other enjoying the last bit of sun as the clouds slowly began to cover them one at a time. Naruto was wearing black sandals with black trousers. The trousers had pockets on the hips and close to the knees. Wrapped around his right thigh was a bandage with a kunai holder strapped to it. He was wearing a baggy zip-up sweater with high collar that covered half his neck and hung loosely around it. It was white in color with a big red stripe in the middle that covered everything from his middle to his chest. On his left shoulder was a swirl pattern patch in gray. All of his clothing were chosen not to hinder any of his movements and weren't too obvious in color. Naruto had grown quite a lot over the last 20 years. His hair had grown a little bit as the locks now reached just around the ears. Because his hair had grown out slightly, it fell down a bit more and didn't look quite as messy as it had been before. Though it was still quite messy by normal standards. He was now 4 foot tall. Robin was a blue-eyed woman. Her eyes weren't as clear and innocent as Naruto's seemed at first glance though. They had more of a darker tone to them and seemed much more mysterious. She had black hair that just about hit her shoulder. She was wearing quite the revealing outfit. Her entire outfit was based on cowgirl style. She was wearing a purple mini skirt that just barely reached halfway her thighs. It had white ornaments hanging from the edges and around her waist was a strip of green and sea blue colored fabric similar to a belt. It was layered with small ornaments and little jewels. Her top was a purple cleavage exposing corset that had laces down the middle showing quite a bit of her assets. On her left upper arm, she had a small purple bracelet-like jewelry with the same white ornaments as the ones hanging from her skirt. She also had a matching purple cowboy hat with high-heeled purple boots which reached just under her knees. They didn't seem to hinder her despite the fact she was on a turtle. Robin had also grown a lot in the years. She didn't reach Naruto in height but was still very tall for a woman reaching 2 foot. Her womanly features had grown to be very attractive. She could probably use them to get men to do what she wanted them to, but Naruto wouldn't allow it. Robin was personally flattered by the way Naruto was protective over her. It was always reassuring to know he cared so much about her. She did the same thing though. He was just so gullible when it came to women and their, sometimes, less than pure methods. Finally, her hair reached slightly under her shoulder blades and she had bangs that stopped just above her eyes. Robin smiled at what Naruto had said. That's sweet of you to say, but you know we wouldn't have survived this long if it weren't for those instincts. He gave her a sheepish smile and looked up, his eyes darkening for a bit. Nay Robin? Hi, she said following his stare. Do you think what Saul said is true? She thought for a bit before sighing. I don't know Naruto, it might be, but it's been far too long to expect anything. We've been alone for 20 years now and managed to survive. I don't think we can afford to let our guard down. You saw what happened to everyone that became involved with us. Following in Naruto's lead, her eyes darkened as she remembered all the times they had gotten help from people. If they were normal citizens they would be betrayed for their bounty. If they were pirates they would be used for their knowledge until the Marines caught up. No matter where they were, the Marines always caught up in the end. They had been lucky that Vice Admiral Kuzan hadn't been seen since Ohara. Naruto nodded at her logic, but seconds after his fist shot up into the air, in an enthusiastic manner. Don't worry Ro. Even with nobody else we still have each other. He smiled his usual sun-like smile. She returned it with her tranquil one. Yeah, thanks Naru. She went to lie back down. Naruto followed and they waited for the turtle to reach Whiskey Peak as he slowly drifted over the ocean into the direction they needed to go. Naruto stared up into the sky as he remembered the last few years. It hadn't been easy for them since they had run from Ohara. Both of them were incredibly sad, having lost the people they came to love. Naruto was especially disappointed in himself for not being able to protect them. Eventually they came to the conclusion that they would have to live and survive if only to honor Olvia and Saul's last wishes. The both of them traveled for a bit trying to get as far away from Ohara as possible. It was only after a couple of weeks of traveling and living on food Naruto managed to gather or steal, the latter of which they had not enjoyed doing. They reached a small village called Mineral. It was very peaceful and pretty isolated, so they decided to stay there. They found a farm and the couple living there was kind enough to let them work and stay there. Everything had been fine for a while. Naruto and Robin worked and the man and woman provided some food for them. They even had dinner with them sometimes. They seemed really nice and Robin and Naruto had thought that staying there wouldn't be so bad, but not long after Naruto heard them talking about exchanging Robin for her bounty. Both Naruto and Robin had apparently each gotten a bounty put on their heads. According to the description, Robin had sunk 6 of the Buster Call ships and if seen she was to be notified to the authorities. She had an amount 79 million berry on her head. Naruto had known it was a ridiculous amount even if he hadn't handled many actual berry yet since leaving the elemental nations. Naruto also had a same amount of bounty as they had been together that day, but his picture was a blur. When he was fighting he hadn't been entirely visible and thanks to his experience with attention he had always taken a position away from sight, behind someone or something. He was slightly relieved though when realized that this had left some options open for them. The description had said that he was Robin's accomplice and that he was highly dangerous and not to be engaged in combat. He had snorted at the last sentence. Spandine really was one big coward, his fist clenched as he thought of that overly irritating man and all the things he'd done. Sadly enough, Naruto's description had been pretty much spot on and he did have pretty notable features. Still, that left a couple of options of him that Robin didn't have. He remembered trying to keep his anger bottled up as the couple had been arguing on whether or not to hand her over. Robin and him had left that same evening before they noticed. After that, nothing changed. They had gotten several jobs and were helped in several villages, but every time those people betrayed them for the amount of money on their heads. So when they finally became old enough, they started to try and fulfill Robin's goal of searching for the poneglyphs. They boarded ships and had alliances with pirates. Because of their individual skills, they were seen as great help to the pirates. Even if it had disgusted them to help such people, they hadn't had much of a choice. Really, they had nowhere else to go. But even pirates couldn't win against the Marines that somehow caught wind of Naruto and Robin every time. So they made it their code to not trust anyone besides one another. Switching jobs and alliances, they made their way through the Grand Line searching for the poneglyphs and clues on the 100-year void. It was only about half a year ago that they finally found a clue on a poneglyph in a country called Alabasta. The Shichibukai, pirates hired by the government, Crocodile had been planning to revive the ancient weapon Pluton. He acted as if he was the hero of the country by helping to protect them from all kinds of disasters. The people there were quite desperate. They had enormous water shortages and the people are on edge as there might be a civil war starting soon. Crocodile started a secret organization called Baroque Works to do all of the dirty work for him as he stayed on the good side of the people there. Naruto and Robin had come in contact with him and formed an alliance. Robin was his right hand, and as she can read the poneglyphs, she was quite important to Crocodile. How would he know where to find Pluton otherwise? Crocodile didn't know, however, that Naruto was also needed to decrypt the poneglyph, but what he didn't know wouldn't hurt him. Naruto wanted to stay by Robin's side, so he had offered to be a secret operator like the Unluckies, who punished those who broke the rules or reported to him if anyone discovered Crocodile's true identity. The man had agreed and allowed Naruto to stay as Robin's bodyguard to ensure her safety in exchange for him doing his job. But that had been half a year ago. Now they were still in this organization. Crocodile hadn't finished his plan yet, but it was due to soon. Naruto heard something in the distance and sat up, leaning his chin on one of his knees. He stared out at sea, trying to see what he had heard. Robin followed his gaze and squinted her eyes slightly. Naruto stood up slowly and pointed to a direction and looked to Robin. "We're there. Whiskey Peak is in the distance and just before the storm arrived." He showed her his trademark grin and jumped onto the turtle head, taking his usual position for when they found something or someplace interesting. She sighed slightly but gave a small smile. She had gotten used to Naruto being jolly over the last 20 years. They had been together the entire time and she still wondered how he could stay so childish. They were 28. She suspected his maturity was lacking behind in time. She heard soft humming and saw Naruto smiling expectantly at the island as if telling it to move towards them. She chuckled and stood up. "You know it won't get any closer just because you want it to." He pouted slightly and crossed his arms. "Yeah, I know, RO, but that doesn't mean I don't want it to. I mean seriously, no offense to Chance, but I've had enough of traveling by turtle on the sea." He jumped onto the ocean and stretched. "I want some movement and not only be surrounded by blue," he said as he pointed to the ocean. "Blue." This time he pointed to the sky, and blue. He said lastly as he pointed to his own eyes, giving her a grin. She gave him an exasperated look and he sighed. "You know what I mean, and you have to admit that was pretty funny." She shrugged and shook her head before turning around and returning to her chair. "Aw, come on, RO." He jumped back onto Chance, the turtle, and sat back on his back, staring at the island from the corner of his eyes. "I hope she doesn't mean the trouble kind of interesting." He smirked a bit, though right now anything is better than doing nothing. Ooh, on the island though, at that moment a group of pirates called the Straw Hat Pirates had partied all night without knowing the true identity of those who occupy the island. Whiskey Peak was an island at which bounty hunters gather, though in reality it was a cover, for the island was actually one of the many secret bases for Baroque Works. A single green-haired man with 3 swords hanging at his hip was sitting on the side of a roof in the village where he had supposedly just drunk himself to sleep. The man's nakama, the Straw Hat Pirates, had all gone into a deep sleep caused by an overdose of happiness. There were various reasons. The captain had eaten himself to sleep, the navigator drunk herself unconscious, the sniper was busy telling lying stories and after he was satisfied fell asleep, and the cook fainted after he got the attention of every woman there. But the green-haired man himself found everything a bit suspicious, so he made sure not to drink too much. Just a couple of barrels, enough that he would stay sober. Now he was following their entertainers to wherever it was they were going. What? That kid has a bounty of 30 million berry. That must be a joke. A dark-skinned muscular woman yelled. The green-haired man looked to where he saw them talking. There were 4 people, the dark-skinned woman who had just screamed, a blue-haired girl, a man with blonde hair and a crown, and an old very broad man with hair that conductors at an opera would always have in pictures. It's as foolish, ma, to judge a pirate by their appearances, Miss Monday. The conductor half sang half spoke to Miss Monday. She blushed a bit and looked down ashamed. But in any case, they are all out cold, so this should make an excellent report for the boss. Now confiscate all the treasure in their ship and make sure to tie them all up. The bounty decreases by 30% if they're dead. The Marines like their public executions after all. The green-haired swordsman decided that it was time to interfere and made himself known. Sorry, but would you mind letting those guys sleep for a bit longer? They're all tired from their journey here. He smirked widely as all 4 of them quickly looked up to where they heard the voice interrupt them in surprise. Why aren't you passed out cold from earlier? The conductor said. The swordsman's smirk grew even wider as drew his sword and held it in front of him, the blade shining in the moonlight. A true swordsman never allows alcohol to take control of him. He stood up and smiled in slightly creepy way. So that's how it was. This place was a den of bounty hunters, and you take advantage of overconfident rookie pirate who just entered the Grand Line. He turned his head slightly and studied his surroundings. Looks like there's about 100 of you. You'll be a fine opponent for me, Baroque Works. Everyone gasped. Ooh, Naruto? She looked up from her book. Nani Naru? He turned to her and pointed to the island that had come significantly closer. Why is there smoke rising from the island? Is there a fire or something? Or maybe even a fight? She chuckled a bit when she saw how eager he looked at the prospect of a fight. Yeah, probably, but Naruto, you know there are hundreds of bounty hunters there. By the time you get there, there won't be much left over, and even then they're probably not in your league. He nodded and sighed for a bit. Yeah, I know, RO. But it's just so boring here. He stared at the island and saw things exploding and smoke going up. He thought for a bit and suddenly he had an idea. Naruto, can I go and see what's happening and then I'll meet you at the port later? She took a sneak towards the island and thought about it. It was better than having him on board being bored. He had been bearable on the way here, but when Naruto became fully bored, bad things tended to happen. For a grown man, he could get really childish sometimes. So she did what she thought best and nodded, smiling when she saw his face light up. Thanks. I'll be back when you reach the port. It might be later if my job comes into play. He yelled at her before jumping onto the water and dashing away in a flash of yellow. Naruto moved swiftly over the surface of the water with hardly any ripples forming as his feet touched the surface. Over the years he had gotten much better at chakra control, and if he said so himself, he was a decent fighter. His speed had increased significantly and it was his source of pride. He could honestly say that in the last 20 years nobody had managed to catch up with him or make a new picture of him. His bounty picture still remained as the young Flash it had been. He had managed to keep them from taking new pictures of Robin, but that was mostly because it was hard recognizing her. The pictures show an 8-year-old and she is now a fully grown woman of 28 years old. There was quite a bit difference between the two now. After a couple of minutes running, he quickly reached the port and followed the sound of fighting he heard. When he reached the plaza, he saw hundreds of bounty hunters lying unconscious on the ground. He smirked slightly at the sight. Just what they need, a single person cutting them all down to dim their arrogance a bit. From the cuts and wounds he could see it was one person who had done so. He whistled and smiled mentally. If this guy was really that strong, maybe he would put up a bit of a fight, but he quickly discarded the thought. Unless it was for defending Robin, he wasn't supposed to fight or show his skills. It would call danger to them and it would be against Crocodile's direct orders to protect and inform. Besides, he had managed to keep his reputation a mystery. Not many people actually knew what he looked like and even less knew his capabilities. He jumped stealthily from roof to roof, making sure to keep to the shadows so that nobody noticed him. It was getting quite easy as it had been getting dark rapidly. He idly thought that Robin was going to need a light to read before he returned his attention to his surroundings. After a while he found a green-haired man fighting agents from Baroque Works that Naruto recognized. They were number agents, bounty hunters who had been chosen by Crocodile as the strongest of their group. The numbers from 12 to 1 signified their strength. The lower the number, the stronger the person. The numbers 6 to 1 were under direct control of Crocodile, while 12 to 6 were indirectly controlled by him as leader of the millions. The even lower thugs that were a part of Baroque Works. Only the number 13 pair was independent. They were the punishment group that ensured the boss's identity stayed secret and the rules were kept. The thing though was that they were called the Unluckies, as encountering them meant but trouble. What was really funny was that they were animals, and technically Naruto was an unlucky, and he was part fox. All the numbers worked in pairs, a man and woman who both had a title to show their position. The green-haired man was wearing a black bandana over his head that was covering his eyes a bit on the top. It gave him a slightly demonic look. He had a white loose shirt and wore black pants with a green haramaki over it, keeping his stomach warm. Lastly, he had black boots that went over his pants but never quite reached his knees. Naruto turned his attention back to the fight and tried to stay serious but soon found himself trying to stifle his laugh. It was hilarious watching them fight. The swordsman was, as far as he could tell, a really strong fighter, but he fought in a ridiculous way, cutting through walls and apparently testing his new swords out against multiple opponents. When he had to fight against Mr. 9, he dodged the attacks, luring the guy in, well, until he threw himself off the building after getting too caught up in the guy's gutsy acrobats, as he himself called it. And if that wasn't embarrassing enough, Miss Wednesday, who was the partner of Mr. 9, would make up for it. She approached him on her super spot build duck Karu and stood up on him and used her Miwaku Memai dance to make the swordsman fall down to his knees. It was quite a pathetic attack, which consisted of using many perfumes and different kinds of smells to make herself more alluring. And she actually had him for a moment too. But then her duck refused to listen to her and ran in the opposite direction. And to add the strawberry to the cake, the green guy himself was actually embarrassed to fight them. He turned to follow them, doing his best and stifling his laugh, though he had the idea he wasn't doing a very good job. Luckily, it became a bit more serious after that. Mr. 9 managed to occupy one of the swordsman's arms and Miss Wednesday had gotten the guy's captain as a hostage. Mr. 8 was standing on the building next to him, having a clear shot with his hair gun, as Naruto called it. The man had guns hidden in his hair. For a moment every one of them smirked and let their guard down. Naruto sighed and used the opportunity to sit back down. He knew this wasn't going to end well for them. And as soon as he thought so, the swordsman pulled the chain that held his arm to him, swinging Mr. 9, who was holding onto it, right into Mr. 8, allowing him to charge for Miss Wednesday while saving his captain in the process. Mr. 9, who had been hit by Mr. 8's bullet, was unconscious, and Miss Wednesday had been hit unconscious by the green-haired man. What Naruto hadn't expected, though, is for the guy to use his captain as a trampoline to cut down Mr. 8. It was pretty funny to see, but he had finished laughing and wanted to see what would happen. Every one of the Baroque work agents on the island had been rendered unable to battle. Naruto watched as the swordsman dumped Mr. 8 and Miss Monday, who had been lying unconscious on that building, off the corner of the roof and calling it cleaning up. After that, the guy just sat down and started to drink. Naruto had to stifle another laugh, but this time the guy noticed it as he turned around, muttering, "I thought I heard something." Naruto looked up to the moon and calculated the time. "Should have been here for far too long. Ro will be at the coast soon." He looked towards the swordsman sitting there one last time before turning tail and jumping on the roofs towards the port. As he got closer, he saw Chance only just drifting into the port. He ran to the side of the pier and sat down, waiting for him to approach. Several minutes later, Robin and Naruto were sitting together on the side of the pier and he was telling her about what he had seen. She laughed a couple of times as he told her about how ridiculous Mr. 9 and Miss Wednesday were acting. But after talking for a while, Naruto noticed someone coming and stood up, staring into an ally. Robin noticed and looked as well. "What's wrong, Naruto?" He kept looking until he realized who it was. "Don't worry, Ro, it's just the unluckies," he said as two animals with big black glasses on walked and flew, respectively, out of the alley. One of them was an otter in a white little wetsuit with pink-purple polka dots all over it. The other was a vulture, and while she didn't have a suit, it would probably be in the way of her flying. She was wearing some kind of bathing cap with the same colors as her partner. They were called Mr. 13 and Miss Friday. They were in a way his partners. As soon as they saw Naruto, they ran towards him, the otter climbing onto his shoulder while the vulture stayed by his feet. The vulture gave Robin several drawn pictures while the otter explained what had happened to Naruto, as he was the only one who could understand them. He thought it had to do with his fox side, but he couldn't be sure of that. After several minutes of explaining, he nodded in understanding as Mr. 13 finished his story. Both animals did a short bow to Naruto and left. Robin turned to Naruto, motioning for him to start explaining as she handed him the photos. He took the photos and looked at them for a while. On it were Miss Wednesday, now publicly known as Nefertari Vivi, the Straw Hat Captain Luffy, the swordsman Zoro, and the navigator Nami. He turned to Robin to explain. According to the unluckies, Miss Wednesday was actually the Princess of Alabasta disguised as a Baroque works agent to gather information. She figured out Crocodile's identity. Mr. 8 was her accomplice, if you can call it that, as he is apparently her caretaker. They requested help from the Straw Hat Pirates. The other girl, Nami, accepted, but only if they would be paid. The princess couldn't accept this as her country barely had any money to spare. Nami in turn refused to help but asked what was happening. Vivi explained the situation to them and said she couldn't tell them who the boss was because that would only endanger them. 2 seconds later, though, she ended up telling them on accident, making them a target for the unluckies. He paused and saw Robin chuckling, and he smiled as he too was thinking that it was pretty funny. He continued, "That is when the unluckies drew their faces as a portrait. Soon after they both let them know that their faces would soon be known by Crocodile. Mr. Five and Miss Valentine showed up after engaging them in battle. It was after that the unluckies left." He took a breath and stopped. "So what are we going to do?" Robin looked him in the eyes and smirked slightly, causing Naruto to shiver. Naruto was a born prankster who, if it didn't bring him and Robin in any real danger, would prank someone any time he could. But Robin was different. She liked embarrassing and creeping out people. She brought her remarks in such a way that it caused the other people to get creeped out. Her knowledge was real, and she could tell them things in exactly such a way that they would believe her. That also meant she could literally tell them anything even if it wasn't true, and she made use of that. Whatever RO is planning, it can't be good for her victims. He smirked, "Though it's gotta be hilarious for us. Let's pay the Straw Hat a visit. The princess should know who I am, and you know what their next island is if they leave from here." He nodded. The next island would be Little Garden, the Island of Giants. He didn't really understand the name but didn't really care either. He had never had to go there. "I'd like to see what kind of people they are." She turned around and walked towards Chance. "Are you coming, Naruto?" He followed her, and Chance slowly paddled his way back out of the bay. Zoro ran through the street. His stupid captain had used his usual non-existing brain to attack him. Why the hell did he have to start thinking now? Oh wait, he didn't think, because whatever goes on in his mind isn't making any sense. According to Luffy, Zoro had cut down every single, innocent person on this island on a rampage. Sure, it was kind of the truth, but he had a really good reason for that, and his captain believed it was because they wouldn't give him any meat. As if he'd cut down someone for not getting him any meat. What was he? A demon? Luffy had attacked him and they had a battle while he should have been protecting that princess. If he didn't, Nami would have his neck, or worse, double his debt. He shivered. "I have to hurry. I am not letting that woman use my debt for any other things." He saw the princess standing on the other side of the street he was running on. In front of her was a man with afro-like hair, black glasses on, a brown coat, and... Wait. He had his finger in his nose. He pulled his finger out of his nose and he propelled whatever he had found in his nose towards the princess. She reacted by jumping out of the way before was probably had been a booger exploded. "That's one hell of a booger bomb," he thought absently. When the guy once more started picking his nose, Zoro charged to the princess without a second thought. The guy took his stance and fired another booger at her, but he jumped in front of her with his sword pushed into the ground in front of them. The booger hit the katana and was split in half, each half exploding as they passed by him and the princess. "Ew, I cut a booger," he said, realizing what he'd done, disgusted for sullying his sword with boogers. The princess seemed to misunderstand shortly and tried to attack, but he blocked it and explained quickly that he was here to help. Grabbing her hand, they tried to run away, but before they even had the chance, something landed in front of them in a crash landing, barely missing both them. When it stood up, it turned out to be a woman. "Kya ha ha ha, you're lucky. If you were hit you would have become pancakes. Kya ha ha ha," she said, all the while smiling. It was creepy actually, that smile. It seemed as if her face had frozen up. She was wearing a yellow dress patterned by orange suns and was holding onto a parasol. What she needed it for he wouldn't know, as it would probably start raining later and there was no sun in sight. But he avoided her and continued running on while she was busy explaining why he was so lucky to have escaped her. As soon as he turned the corner, though, Luffy was standing there. Thinking he was going to attack, he took on a stance. Luffy, though, seemed to have other ideas. "Ooh, there you are, Zoro. Sorry about attacking you," he said with his usual goofy smile. Zoro relaxed and pointed behind him. "Hey Luffy, could ya take care of those guys?" Luffy gave him his trademark grin. He always wondered how Luffy could have a grin so big it nearly seemed to leave his face. "Ooh, leave it to me," his captain yelled as he charged at the two Baroque workers. "Is he gonna be alright? They're two number agents," the blue-haired princess asked worriedly, while Karoo was quacking in agreement. "Number agents? I don't know what that is, but our captain is strong. No need to worry." She nodded hesitantly as he started running again, motioning for her to follow. "But why did you save me?" she asked. He thought for a moment about how to explain. "Well, our navigator made a deal with that big curly-haired guy, and she blackmailed me into getting you." "Igaram? Did he send you, so he is safe?" As he nodded, she let out a relieved sigh and concentrated on the road. Soon they reached the clearing where Igaram and Nami were waiting. Vivi was telling Nami that they could not afford the kind of money she wanted them to be paid for helping her to reach Alabasta. Zoro himself also thought 1 billion berry was too much for escorting someone. Nami didn't relent but instead asked her why a princess was all the way here, and she started to explain. Apparently her kingdom was being ruined by a civil war started by Baroque works, and if she can confront the rebel army with the information on the true cause of the war, she can end it. The leader of Baroque works, according to her, wants to take over Alabasta and turn it into an ideal nation, ruled by him. She told them she couldn't tell them who the leader was though, as that would turn the danger to them. Ironically though, she ended up telling them in her warning, "Crocodile of the Shichibukai." One of the Shichibukai. Nami screamed. Zoro had to cover his ears to prevent lasting damage. "What is a Shichibukai?" he asked. She glared at him but sighed. The Shichibukai are 7 pirates who have an alliance with the Marines. In exchange for doing things for them, they are free to roam the seas and to do their own businesses. But only the strong are chosen for this position, as it's also a way to intimidate other pirates not to try anything. He nodded before smirking. "Ooh, so we're being targeted by such a strong guy. That makes my blood boil." Nami was comically crying, cursing herself for being nakama to such people, but soon she realized something else. "Wait a minute, they don't know we know, Zoro, we're leaving." "Sorry princess, but we're not getting involved." She turned around, grabbing Zoro by the ear before stopping abruptly. Zoro pulled his ear free and tried to see to where she was looking. Around the corner of a house, partly sitting behind a wall, were 2 animals. One of them, an otter he thought it was drawing something and had an evil glint in his eyes. After a couple of seconds, he seemed done and turned his paper around to show them. On it were very well drawn pictures of all 4 of them: Nami, Zoro, Luffy and Vivi. "Ooh, you're good," Nami said, clapping her hands, earning her a sweat drop from Vivi and him, before she realized the dilemma and started crying comically again as the otter left on the back of the vulture. "Well Nami, it seems they do know." He laughed loudly. She glared at him and turned to Vivi. "Well, it seems we're going to be helping, but you better pay us afterwards." Vivi nodded hesitantly. "I can't promise anything from the country, but I have some money on my account. It's not much, but it's something if that's enough." Nami took her hand and gave it a shake. "We'll take it." Zoro rolled his eyes, muttering, "Yeah, you're taking it all right. But shut up," as Nami glared at him. "Did you say something, Zoro?" She gave him one of those almost sickly sweet smiles, but Zoro could feel the tension. "No, nothing. I didn't say nothing." She smiled once more. "I thought so. Now we have to head back to the ship and leave. Zoro, go get Luffy." But before she could continue, they heard a yell. "Ui, Nami, Zoro, I'm back," and they saw Luffy running towards them. Nami stepped forward and grabbed him by the ears. "Be quiet and follow me, we're going back to the ship." He nodded, trying to get out of her grip, and the rest all moved back before returning to the ship. After getting Usopp and Sanji, of course. They all turned back to go to the pub they were at before all this mess started, but Igaram stopped all of them. "Wait, we need a plan." He held one of his hands under his chin in a thinking position. "Princess Vivi the First will act as a decoy while you escape with them." She gasped and stormed towards Igaram. "No, Igaram, I won't allow you to put yourself in danger for me." But she couldn't continue her speech as Igaram interrupted her. "Vivi Ojou." She shut up and looked at Igaram. He hardly ever shouted at her, always being calm and peaceful, only shouting when it was of utmost importance. "You are the hope of our country, Princess Vivi. We cannot let anything happen to you. Do you understand? I know you do not want people to be in danger because of you, but you must understand you are the hope of millions of people." She nodded weakly as some tears left her face, but she made a determined face and turned to give him a hug. Igaram hugged back and they left to finish his plan. 5 minutes later he came back, forced in Vivi's spare clothing with a wig on, with 3 other ragdolls who were supposedly Luffy, Nami and Usopp. Luffy was the first to react by bursting out in tears. "Ha ha ha, you look amazing. Just like Vivi." But he was punched on the head by Nami for comparing Igaram to Vivi, as they looked nothing alike. Zoro stepped forward and turned around, standing with his back towards Igaram and with a smirk on his face. "You think that," he pointed with his thumb behind him, "will work?" Igaram told them it was the only plan, and after a heartfelt goodbye from Vivi, who was feeling miserable without Igaram there with her, he left towards one of the ship as the bay. They watched him go and turned to leave for their own ship, but only seconds after they started walking. Igaram's ship exploded in the distance, with bits and pieces of the ship and fire from the explosion reaching them. Vivi panicked and tried to run back and jump into the water, screaming for Igaram, but she couldn't, as Zoro and Luffy were holding her back and dragging her back to the ship. "Vivi, it's too late. Old man Chikua made this chance for us. We have to go," Luffy told her in a moment of smarts. She looked at them with tears in her eyes, but slowly she grew determined and nodded. She stood up and soon they were running towards the ship, Luffy taking a short detour to pick up their other 2 teammates. "Ooh, what's going on? Why are we setting sail so soon? Can't we stay another couple of nights or so?" Their party was a blast and there were so many cute girls. The blonde-haired guy with curled eyebrows yelled. The other guy with the long nose nodded enthusiastically and provided his own opinion on the matter. "Yeah, we have no idea when we'll get to another island like this, so let's take things nice and slow. We're pirates, you know." Naruto, who was sitting on the mast, sweat dropped. "What does being pirates have to do with that?" He snickered a bit but made sure he wasn't heard. And they haven't even noticed that their supposed enemy is sitting on their mast. He heard Zoro ask Nami beneath him on whether they should explain to them that the island was full of bounty hunters. She waved him off and told him it was done, showing him by her beaten-up long nose and curly brow. Zoro was speechless as he, Luffy and Vivi each took a step back. The mist is lifting, it's almost morning, Nami told the crew, while Long Nose and Curly Brow were still lying on the deck half dead. They all relaxed a little, but that didn't last long. Be careful not to crash the ship into the rock near the shore, and congratulations on your escape, someone said. Naruto smiled as he saw Robin had joined him on their ship. He smirked slightly and stood up to get a better look at what Robin was planning. Ought to be fun, maybe I'll join her in a few minutes. Wah! Who's that? They all yelled, but Robin just calmly looked around. What a nice ship this is. Vivi looked distraught at seeing Robin, but that was probably because she knew who Robin was. And why shouldn't she? She knew the identity of the boss. I must tell you, I met up with Mr. 8 a short while ago. Ooh, low blow. Naruto thought. Aro must really loves messing with people. Who's the bomb person here? Not Robin. Vivi was beginning to get mad, concluding from the remark that it was her who blew up Mr. 8. What are you doing here, Miss All Sunday? Princess yelled at her, while Luffy was asking where she came from in the background. Everyone gasped, except for Luffy, who was still busy in his own little world, before finally realizing she was a part of Baroque Works. Who is it this time? Whose partner is she? Nami asked. She is the partner of Mr. Zero. She is the only one allowed to know the identity of the boss, which is why Igaram and I tailed her. Robin smiled at her. Well, technically I let you tail me, and I'm not the only one allowed to know the boss's identity, she said. Vivi's eyes went wide as she realized it was probably true. Her tailing had gone a bit too smoothly. Luffy, who was standing next to her, made another out-of-place comment. Ooh, so she is a good guy. Everyone once more ignored him and proceeded with their conversation. I know that, and I bet you're the one who told the boss we knew. And what do you mean, one of the people who know the boss's identity? There is nobody else who should know, Vivi said. Once more Luffy made his godlike comment. Ooh, so she is a bad guy. At this point Naruto had a hard time stifling his laughing, as everything Luffy did seemed totally ridiculous to him. He held his hand in front of his mouth and squeezed his stomach, trying to stop. Well, you of all people should know of Agent Black, technically one of the unluckies but in a higher league. Her eyes widened as she had heard about him before. What is she talking about, Vivi? Nami asked, not entirely following the story. Agent Black is an independent entity that only the boss can order. Mostly his job consists of informing the boss of those who discovered his identity, hence being part of the unluckies, those animals we saw earlier. But he is also used for missions that are to be kept ultimately secret, as nobody besides Mr. Zero and Miss All Sunday have ever seen him before. He is a person shrouded in more mystery than Crocodile himself. When she explained this, Robin started laughing, making Vivi a bit mad. Why are you laughing? Did I say anything wrong? Robin smiled at her and shook her head. No, everything you just said is correct. It's just funny hearing someone call him mysterious. And she chuckled once more. Why is that so funny? Vivi asked in tone slightly lower time. Robin smirked, causing everyone to flinch. Why don't you ask him that yourself? Their eyes widened as they heard laughing from above. Ha 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 ha. R.O. Ha ha ha. That was hilarious. I can't stop laughing. Naruto laughed as he jumped next to her from his place on the mast. He took a couple of deep breaths and calmed down, giving the audience his biggest smile. One of them had their mouths dropped to their collarbones, and Naruto decided to add to the shock. He stood up and did a mock bow. Nice to meet you, I'm Agent Black. And he once more burst out laughing as he saw them open their mouths even further. Robin turned to him. Now Black Sand, that wasn't very nice. We should be polite to our guests. Naruto winked and just pointed a single finger towards Robin. But R.O., you had all the fun. She smiled at him. That's no excuse, and you know it, Black Sand. He sighed and sat on the ledge of the boat next to Robin. Slowly the group recovered, and Vivi was the first to shake out of it. That's Mr. Black. But you're so young, she said, astonished, not noticing a tick mark appearing on his head. Next was Sanji, who put up another cigarette. I don't know what's going on, but aren't rumors usually exaggerated? Also not noticing the tick mark growing bigger, the last one of the group to shake out of his stupor was Zoro. What's with that stupid grin? He said with a smirk. You know it makes you look kinda stupid. The last one made Naruto snap. He knew those last two were on purpose in some way. Robin looked at her partner and sighed. You guys just dug your grave. Usopp started laughing, apparently gaining his confidence after what Sanji and Zoro said. Yeah right, he looks like he couldn't kill a fly. But before he could say anything more, Naruto disappeared from sight, shocking everyone there as he reappeared behind Usopp with a kunai held to his neck. Everyone reacted straight away, taking on offensive and defensive positions. Usopp shook and Naruto could see he was on the verge of fainting, so he left it at that, disappearing from sight and reappearing once more next to Robin in his original spot. Does he have a devil fruit? Nami asked worriedly. Nope, I don't have a devil fruit, I just ran. Everyone looked at him shocked, but Zoro was the one to ask, you just ran? We didn't even see you, Naruto smirked. Well, that just shows we're trained differently, besides it was only a threat. At this they looked at him blankly. He assumed they didn't see the reason, so he explained. You guys just full out insulted me on 3 different fronts and didn't even realize it? Either you're extremely ignorant or just a group of very big idiots. First of all, yeah, my nickname is Mr. Black, and just cause I'm relatively young doesn't change that, and even that doesn't make any sense. I'm 27, at least a decade older than some of you, and lastly, he looked at Zoro in particular. The guy just seemed like the most serious one in the crew. My grin is something you'd have no need for, as living in the light doesn't require it, he said, leaving most of them quite confused. Though Zoro seemed to have understood the message, and maybe that curly-browed guy too, as his eyes widened, but that could be from staring at Robin. Vivi finally couldn't seem to take it any longer and yelled out, what have you come here for? She panted heavily and glared at the both of them, though she seemed slightly more fixed on Robin. Aro smiled, put one of her elbows on her knees and her hands under her chin. Her other arm over her legs. Her position just radiated amusement at the situation. Don't get so worked up, she said calmly. I am not here on any specific orders. I didn't even come here to fight you. What I came here for is to give some advice to a pitiful group of pirates. Vivi raised an eyebrow, probably wondering what she meant. You have chosen an unfortunate route. The name of your next island is Lil Garden. Even if I weren't to raise a single hand towards you, it's more than likely that you'll never reach Alabasta. She flicked her hand in an upwards motion and Luffy hat flew towards her. The moment she had done so, Luffy started to yell like a little kid who had gotten his favorite toy taken away from him. She passed the hat to Naruto, who held it in his hands, examining it. Surprisingly, it looked really well worn. It seemed to have been torn a few times, but it had been neatly taken care of by patching it. Without ever meeting Crocodile, the curtains of your lives will close. Everyone on the ship was listening closely to what she was saying, well besides Luffy. But from what Naruto had garnered, the captain of this crew didn't actually have much of an attention span. Without listening to the story Robin was telling his crew, the captain lurched out to grab his hat. Naruto jumped out of the way and landed on the mast with a ridiculously high jump. Everyone was shaking out of their stupor and they quickly turned to watch the happenings on the other side of the ship. Luffy was trying to grab the hat from Naruto while acting like some kind of monkey or child, maybe a combination of both. Maybe the man thought his namesake important. Naruto dodged a couple of attempts from Luffy to grab his straw hat before his arms started stretching out way in front of him. He has a devil fruit, should be fun to mess with. He smirked slightly while dodging another grab in his direction. Though it was starting to seem more like a punch than a lurch, really. He jumped from the mast where he had been and landed on the deck right next to Zoro, who was staring at him. Naruto smiled wildly, enjoying the situation. It had been a long time since he had been in something of a spar. Every fight up until had been something of a life and death battle. You always had to take the situation seriously. But at the moment it wasn't at all like that. He didn't have to worry about many of the usual dangers, and the both of them could easily escape. But most of all, this crew radiated a sense of peace and enjoyment. They didn't quite seem like the usual pirates they'd encountered over the years. Robin was watching this from her set and smiled in a slightly genuine way. It's been a while since I saw Naruto genuinely enjoy himself in front of people besides me. She watched for a while before turning back to her discussion on Little Garden. Robin wasn't the only who had noticed. Zoro, who had been standing very close to Naruto before he jumped out of the way to dodge, Luffy had seen the smile. That smile was definitely different from the grins he's shown before. He pondered for a bit on whether he was really just there to spy on them. The guy seemed to enjoy himself well enough. A bit immature though. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the ridiculous speculations. The guy was after all an enemy. The thoughts lingered though. Naruto, who had now taken position on the sheephead at the front of the boat, was immensely enjoying himself in the chase. Luffy hadn't been able to capture him yet, but the captain seemed to be having a lot of fun himself. Luffy had somehow come to realize that Naruto wasn't really going to damage his hat and his attacks weren't as dangerous as before. He really had to admit it. Despite being a bit of an idiot, the team did have something of a sixth sense. Nonetheless, Luffy wanted his hat, so he continued chasing. He looked out over the ocean while jumping to the other side of the boat. He noticed Robin was keeping the others occupied with her creepy stories about Little Garden. She managed to do it without actually telling them what's on the island and why it was so dangerous. Naruto shook his head with amusement. He really didn't understand his gift for creeping out others. Turning his eyes back to the ocean, he suddenly had an idea. Oi Mugiwara. You've eaten a devil's fruit, right? Luffy stopped and nodded. Yeah, I ate the Gomu Gomu no Emi. My body is made of rubber. Naruto made an acknowledging sound. Everyone had turned their way to see what was going on. Naruto smirked, so you can't swim. Here catch. Without giving Luffy even the time to think of other methods to catch his hat, he threw it out above the ocean. He watched as Luffy jumped after it. Everyone gasped, immediately cursing themselves for even thinking Mr. Black was the lesser evil of the two. They really shouldn't have let their attention waver. Zoro made a move to jump into the water, calling Luffy an idiot, but he didn't quite the chance to. Naruto had moved first. He disappeared and reappeared almost immediately after, standing next to where the hat was floating, standing on the water. He laughed as he watched Luffy panic slightly in the water. After a while he'd had enough fun and grabbed Luffy by the collar. Within a second they were back on the boat while Luffy had his hat back. Everyone watched the strange situation with surprised looks. Well, what do you expect? Someone did just stand on top of the ocean. Robin was genuinely amused, and she didn't hide it when she turned towards Mr. Black. Everyone noticed how different her reaction now was compared to what they had seen earlier. It seemed more real, as if colors had finally been added to a painting. A moment later she started laughing. Nay Naru, I thought I was being mean by telling them scary stories about their next destinations and letting them assume that I assassinated Mr. 8, but you take it to a whole new level. She continued to chuckle while everyone else was just shocked. She hadn't been the one that killed Igaram-san. Naruto smirked slightly when he saw their surprise and walked back to where she was. Sitting down on the railing next to her, he put ankle on top of the knee of his other leg, before pointing a finger towards the entire crew for effect. Well, what did you expect? That Robin killed Mr. 8. Come on, it was an explosion. Wouldn't you normally think it was the explosion guy who did that? He said, seeing from the corners of his eyes how everyone was mentally berating themselves for being so stupid. Besides, I'm the one who has the skills to actually make it into a joke, he said, aggravating Robin a bit while enjoying the moment. Robin glared at him for implying she didn't have any skills. Jokes she didn't really care for, but her skills were something she was quite proud of. He grinned at the glare and jumped away from her, landing behind Zoro, who had been leaning against the stairs wall. Nay, how did you do that? Naruto turned to look at Zoro and tilted his head slightly in confusion. Do what? Before sitting down and leaning with his back against the wall. The man raised an eyebrow. Stand on the water. You said you ate no devil's fruit, so how? Naruto could pretty much see that Zoro was genuinely curious, but he really couldn't help himself. The prankster inside of him demanded it be so. So he closed his eyes, put his hands behind his neck and smirked slightly in amusement. Well, I put one foot on the water, then add my other foot next to it. The last step is the most important. You add your weight onto both feet. He smirked when Zoro developed a tick mark from annoyance. He let the man simper for a while longer before deciding it was enough. Yay, I get what you mean. It's my genetics. My body is stronger and has several capabilities allowing me to do stuff others can't. You could say it's normal for my kind, but that implies I'm not human and they are, well, mostly. Zoro noticed that he had said, they, but didn't call him out on it. So there are others who can do that? Naruto opened his eyes and sighed. Yeah, but not here or anywhere close by though. Zoro's posture slunk slightly and sent out a few hints of disappointment. Had he been interested? Why aren't they? Naruto's eyes darkened a bit as he listened to the question. He turned away and walked to the water where Chance was now drifting next to the boat. Climbing onto the turtle's back, he Zoro's stare and question. "R.O., we have to leave now. I still have that report to write and the unluckies will be coming to get it in an hour or two to deliver it to the old prick." Robin chuckled slightly and turned to the pirates and tossed over something to the princess. Vivi caught it and saw it was an eternal pose with the name Nanamanai Shima on it. That eternal pose will take you to an island close to Alabasta. They were deciding on whether to take it, but before they could contemplate seriously, Luffy grabbed it and crushed it in his hands. Silence reigned across the small caravel's deck before Nami hit him on the head. "What did you that for, you idiot? What if she's a good person?" Luffy stared her, half glaring, before turning his gaze towards Robin. "She doesn't decide the course of this ship." His glare definitely had an intensity most didn't have. "Besides, she's the partner of that kid who stole my hat, so I don't like her." And there went the moment. The captain's tone had taken an almost petulant edge to it. It no longer sounded serious or intense. It was as if he didn't entirely mean what he had said. Luffy glanced to the guy laying on the turtle slightly before returning his gaze to the woman. Nami noticed this and had to admit it. Despite them being from Baroque works, they didn't seem so bad. Robin sighed before standing up and jumping off the ship onto Chance. The old turtle slowly started to paddle away from the caravel. "Well, it's your loss." They could just about hear Luffy yell about a giant turtle before the other boat started to change its course away from them. Having arrived back at the base in Alabasta, Naruto and Robin entered the giant casino, rain dinners. The building had been their base ever since Crocodile started to stay in Alabasta on a longer basis. After the man became this country's hero, he decided to publicly live somewhere slightly more open, but since he was the kind of guy who wouldn't even think to live in anything even similar to a normal house. Personally, Naruto thought that if the man acted any more vain than he already did, well, let's just say he'd be hard-pressed to keep his snide remarks to himself. So Crocodile had a casino built in the middle of a small city in Alabasta. It was thanks to the casino that the city had flourished and more people had come to see Crocodile as their hero. Without even knowing what the guy is planning, Naruto thought absently. Naruto and Robin were escorted through the casino to the entrance of one of the VIP rooms, and they followed the man through the hallway until they reached a door at the end. The door had a golden name plate with Crocodile written on it. Their escort opened the door after knocking on it politely and announced that Sir Crocodile, as they called him, had visitors. After the man got a short reply, he waved them in and closed the door behind them. Naruto and Robin stood atop the staircase patiently waiting for a signal to tell them otherwise. Really, Naruto did always find it a bit bothersome to have to act subservient. Doing so is pretty much considered a requirement when one participates in something called an alliance. Especially when your party isn't exactly what one would call the more powerful one. Naruto took a moment to inspect the room. As usual, the room was luxuriously decorated and quite spacious as well. Comically enough, the walls were made of alabaster stone. They were decorated across with jewels, portraits and chandeliers. At the heart of the room, a very long rectangle table had been placed. A table fit for kings was probably what Crocodile would say. Not that Naruto really cared. Of course, the man in particular was sitting at the head of that same table at that very moment. "Sue, Miss All Sunday and her fox are visiting me. I feel honored." The man chuckled in a highly sarcastic matter-of-fact tone. Now usually Naruto would lash out verbally at being compared to an animal and being called something similar to a lapdog, but when they compared him to the right animal without knowing about his condition, he didn't mind it as much. It actually made the situation slightly humorous in his eyes. Besides, he knew Robin didn't see him as such. As such, he acted as was required of him, well, mostly. "Mr. Crocodile, I have returned from my mission." He bowed deeply despite his disgust at having to do so. He swallowed his pride though and did anything necessary for them to survive. Crocodile barely acknowledged him as he ordered, "Report." Naruto nodded. "Mr. 12 has been captured by the Marines and revealed nothing. I observed as the Billions tried to kill him to assure a free spot in the ranks. They didn't succeed. The Marines took him out of range for further interrogation." Before he could continue, Crocodile took a puff on his cigarette and asked a question. "You did put an end to that, right?" It was more of a threat, that he'd better have done so. Nonetheless, Naruto answered it, "Yes, sir." Crocodile turned to Robin. "Miss All Sunday, it will almost be time for Mission Utopia to be put into action, so I suggest you get prepared." She nodded and turned to leave before the man continued. "I have another announcement." She turned back to look at the smoking man once more while Naruto continued to look as he'd been doing before. "A week ago I sent a mission for Mr. 3 to complete, but he has failed to report and broke one of our rules. While on a mission, always keep contact within the span of a week or risk being assassinated to keep the chances of secrets being exposed minimized." That idiot, Naruto thought. He didn't particularly like Mr. 3, what he had seen of the guy was pure arrogance, but he still didn't like the prospect of death all that much either, especially if he was going to be the one delivering it. As such, he is to be observed, and if the situation requests so will be assassinated. "I will be having one of the unluckies. Mr. Black go. You are to go to Little Garden where he was last seen by one of the other unluckies and observe. You are to inquire him about his mission and take actions appropriate for it. Any other situations are your call." Naruto had to smile slightly at this. The man's orders pretty much left him the freedom to act as he pleased. Though it quickly receded to a frown as he realized something else. What about Miss All Sunday? Crocodile let his loud laugh harmonize through the room until it receded into chuckles. "Yes, I had thought you would be worried about your owner," he said with a belittling edge to his voice. "I'm sure you'd rather be there to guard her, but she is needed here from Mission Utopia. I suggest you finish up quickly and return here in time for your part of the plan. Whatever you are going to do, make sure you return here within 2 weeks. I will allow no contact, but if you do not return within that time, you know the consequences." He let it hang for a bit before continuing, "So I don't suggest doing so. Now I am busy." The both of you are dismissed. Naruto and Robin left the room quickly and walked out of the casino in small steps, neither of them really pleased at having to be separated again. They had hardly been apart in their years together, with the exceptions of a couple of days during several missions that had been given by some of their previous bosses. But never for quite this long. These particular amounts of time had only appeared since they made an alliance with Crocodile. "So I guess we'll be splitting up for a while," Naruto said quite calmly and smiled reassuringly. But he knew she had noticed it wasn't his usual happy smile. Naruto, don't worry, we've both managed to get this far and you have to admit it wasn't only you doing the work. Robin grinned cheekily at her partner in crime. He nodded and sighed before giving her a real smile and giving her a small nudge. What she said was true. Robin had saved him several times from dangerous situations before. She had really learned how to use her powers, and if the need arises her charms helped. Though he would never let her go too far with the latter. Yeah, I know, so I guess I'll be seeing you in a maximum of 2 weeks. He gave her a short hug and another serious smile. She smiled back at him and nodded. Yeah, Naruto, I'll see you soon and then we'll be one step closer to our dream. This time it was his turn to nod before he turned away and left. After a couple of hours walking, Naruto finally reached the edge of Alabasta facing the sea. After making sure nobody was watching him, he jumped onto the water, leaving for the island called Little Garden. It was hours of running later that Naruto had finally had enough. He didn't really mind running all that much, but when it was for hours on end with no sign of an island, it just started piss him off really. He checked his eternal pose for Little Garden and saw it was still pointing in the direction had been running all this time. He stared in the same direction for a few moments, thinking of ways to make this more interesting. Suddenly he had an idea. Well, not too sudden, he had been thinking about it after all. He sat down for a moment and grabbed into his pouch, getting out a bandana scarf. Together with the eternal pose, he threw it in the air before quickly transforming into his elegant fox half. After having fully changed his form, he caught the bandana and posed with his mouth. He wiggled his head through the bandana until it was properly placed around his neck, then he shoved the pose into it. As a fox he hadn't changed all that much, but as his human half grew, his fox half also seemed to do so. He was much bigger than a normal fox. He reached about the size of a wolf. Other than his size, only one thing had changed over the years, and that was his tail, or rather tails. He used to only have one like a normal fox, but over the years they had increased to 3 tails. After the first extra one appeared he had freaked out, but when the third had come both Robin and him thought it had to do with him growing either older or stronger. The last 20 years had allowed for quite some experience in the field to be gained. Because his clothes and most of his luggage mysteriously disappear when he is a fox, he learned quickly that to avoid losing the stuff he needed when transforming, they had to not be touching him while doing so. Since he was on the ocean right now, the sky was pretty the only place he could put it, if only temporarily. The bandana itself was red in color and slightly checkered with a square line that went along the sides of the entire scarf. The line was a lighter shade of red. In the same shade as the line was a small 9-tailed fox engraved on the corner. The 9-tailed fox was positioned exactly so it was seen on the corner of the bandana as Naruto wore it slightly to the side of his neck. This should make my journey a bit more interesting, he thought. The world always seemed more interesting to watch when he saw it through a fox's eyes. His senses were enhanced and people always seemed to think less of a fox. It made observations and such easier and quite a bit funnier to do. And so he continued his journey onwards to Little Garden. After running for another couple of hours, much to his displeasure, he finally reached an island. He checked the eternal pose and saw it was pointing towards the island. I guess that's finally Little Garden then. He ran to the beach and jumped onto the sand. Without a care in the world, he lay down and stretched out in the sun. There was hardly a reason not to enjoy the moment after all. He stretched his paws in front of him, laying there for a moment enjoying the sun and the smell of the forest. After a couple of minutes enjoying his surroundings, he heard a loud sound in the distance. Immediately he stood up and took an alert position, but soon realized the sound came from far away. What kind of thing makes that kind of a sound? He though slightly bewildered, though mostly excited. He ran towards the forest and in one jump reached a high tree branch. He jumped from tree branch to tree branch, picking up in speed as he moved. He was making sure he didn't miss anything on the way. Gegyagyagyagya, he heard in the distance and he froze up. His mind blanked for a moment and he slipped of the tree branch he'd landed on. Landing quite harshly on the ground, he actually ignored the entire accident and stood up immediately. That laugh sounded oddly familiar to a certain giant's laugh. He ran in between the trees, no longer paying any attention to anything else around him. He sped through them and came to a clearing in less than a couple of seconds. He stopped at the clearing because in front of him was a giant sitting there eating a small piece of meat. Why the hell is Luffy eating the giant chunk of meat while the giant is eating a piece of meat the size of his fingertip? Naruto thought incredulously as he watched Luffy sitting next to the giant. Oh yeah. They'd chosen the route to Little Garden. I'd forgotten that little fact. He watched Vivi and Luffy sit next to the giant. Gyagyagyagya, your pirate lunchbox is also very good, though a bit small. The giant laughed, so that's why their portions are switched. Naruto continued watching the giant and Luffy talking and pretty much started rolling around in laughter when Luffy told the giant that if he hadn't liked the lunchbox he would have kicked his ass. Seriously, who'd threaten a giant about meat? Of course this didn't go unnoticed as Vivi turned around and saw him, but he was too busy laughing to notice. After a couple of minutes of listening to the two telling each other ridiculous things, Naruto finally calmed down, but it was a bit late when he felt himself being pulled into an embrace. Ah, how cute. But what's a fox doing here? I don't think there were any in the prehistoric. Although Naruto didn't show it on the outside, he was panicking on the inside. Touch was something he had associated with danger over the years. Really only Robin ever touched him, and that wasn't usually more than a hug on occasions. And look, he has 3 tails. At that Naruto froze. He had long learned that anyone who knew what a fox with more tails than one meant was trouble. Naruto was a 9-tailed fox. He'd learned that from Gigi in his old village after he'd told him who his mother was. In the beginning he didn't really know the difference. He only had 1 tail, so was the difference? But after the tails started to increase, he realized he was also getting stronger. He was also pretty sure that his fox side had something to do with the poneglyphs, so he'd learned over the years that anyone who knew what kind of fox he was spelled trouble. The fact that the fox froze hadn't gone unnoticed by Vivi. Before she could say anything else though, Naruto disappeared in smoke and he appeared a couple of meters away from her in a defensive position. In his place was wooden log. Naruto had learned several jutsus over the years. Most of them were from memory or just based on ideas he'd had. He'd also remembered a lot from the books Professor Clover had shown him, and he made it a point to learn those too. Vivi stood up calmly and looked him in the eye. She made a slight move forward but stopped as she saw that he growled a bit. Instead of moving closer, she got into a squat position and put her hand in front of her, showing she meant no harm. Naruto watched for a bit as she sat there patiently. After a while he figured she meant no harm. She had looked surprised about his multiple tails. He slowly moved closer to her hand until he ended up nuzzling it slightly with his nose. She let out a small squeal and slowly started petting him. Soon he was enjoying it and sat down next to her as she was petting his head and scratching his ears. He shouldn't really be letting he pet him though. He did have a job to do after all. It shouldn't matter to him that her scratching under his ears just felt exquisite. As Vivi was scratching him under the ears, he felt her touch his bandana and she stopped. He looked up and saw she was curious about the bandana. He opened his mouth to explain but realized he was still a fox and couldn't talk. He stood up and motioned to Vivi that he wasn't going to go. She seemed surprised. He figured it was probably that a fox was communicating with her. He walked around the clearing a bit until he saw a patch of sand. He chirped to her and motioned with his head for her to come. She walked over and he sat down once more. She followed his lead though curious as to why. He moved one of his tails in front of him and began to draw words on the sand. She seemed to understand what he was trying to do but was too perplexed a fox could write to react as he continued writing. The scarf was a present from a friend long ago. Was the message he'd left in the sand. She nodded. Why did you tell me this? His sweat dropped slightly and turned to the sand, moving his tails. Because you looked curious about it. She blushed a bit about being caught in the act. Thanks, I was indeed curious. Why don't you join us for lunch? I'm sure Luffy-san and Dory-san won't mind. He looked at her surprised. What kind of person would invite a fox to lunch? I'm a fox. He wrote in the sand. She smiled at the comment. Who cares? Dory-san is a giant. And I would like to pet you more, she said, adding the last part softly. He still heard it though. He contemplated her point for a while before nodded, not minding the last bit. Staying by their side might also make it easier for him to move around the island. He was in no way being persuaded by the prospect of being scratched under his ears. Nope, he was an adult and knew when to act like one. Vivi stood and walked towards Luffy and Dory. She shortly motioned for him to follow and continued walking. He sighed for a bit and also stood up. Why ignore an offer when it gets you a free lunch? Hey Vivi, where were why? What's with that fox? Vivi, we already have meat, you know. Naruto's sweat dropped and took a couple of steps back. He'd rather not end up as the lunch, not that they could catch him, but still. Luffy-san. He is not for you to eat, he is. She paused for a bit before turning to him. What is your name? He chuckled a bit and moved his tail to right before he paused. Should he give them his real name? Well, it didn't really matter. Nobody besides Robin knew the difference between his code names and his real name. He wrote down his real name. My name is Naruto. That's quite a strange name for a fox. He glared at her for a bit before relenting and once more moving his tails. Yeah, but it means maelstrom and not fishcake, and at that she started laughing. That's so cool, he heard as he was pounded into a hug by Luffy. He kept his instincts to run at bay and tried to shake him off. In vain. You can write, he yelled in Naruto's ears. He was held for a couple of seconds as Luffy continued to spout off rubbish. Finally Naruto had enough and performed a substitution, leaving a piece of wood in his place. He reappeared a couple of meters away and walked to stand by Vivi, the one he deemed to be the safer of the two. He thought he saw recognition in the eyes of the giant, but it disappeared as soon as it had appeared, so he didn't know for sure. The sparkle in Luffy's eyes had increased and he started to chase Naruto around, telling him how awesome that trick was and asking him to explain. without even giving him the time to actually do so. He could see a tick mark grow on Vivi's head, and as soon as it had started the quarrel died and she made them both sit down again with a lump on their heads. Why me too? He thought. They started eating and Naruto had gotten a bit of meat from Vivi, who in turn had gotten it from Luffy. While they were eating, she suddenly asked a question. Dory-san, why are you living alone on this island? The giant looked up and started laughing again. Well, actually I'm not living alone. There is another giant on this island, but you see we come from a village called Elbaf. At this Naruto raised his eyebrows. It was the village Saul had talked about. At our village we have a certain law. If a quarrel breaks out and we cannot settle it ourselves, then we beseech our god Elbaf for his judgment. Elbaf is just and bestows protection on those who are right. He'll ensure the survival of the righteous, he said. Naruto could see where this was heading. No wonder Saul didn't want to be compared to those from Elbaf, he who seeks peace and they who seek battle and fight for pride. He thought before he turned his attention back to the giant. So this island has been the battleground between us to settle our argument, but it's been 100 years and we can't seem to settle it. Dory continued laughing. You've been living for 100 years? Luffy screamed and Naruto had to shield his ears. We live 3 times longer than your puny one, Dory said while snickering at the outburst. That was when Vivi decided to cut in. But even if you live longer, how could you want to continue fighting that long? What kind of reason is there? She said, distraught and not understanding. But before the giant could continue or explain, the volcano on the island exploded and he stood up. Looks like it's time. I'm not sure when we decided it, but we decided that whenever the volcano exploded we would fight. He got ready to leave and fight, but Vivi shouted once more in a bit of a panic. What? You two can't possibly hate each other so much that you would want to continue trying to kill each other for 100 years. Just what exactly was the cause? But before she could continue, Naruto pulled on her ponytail with one of his tails. She glared at him but saw the serious expression, if she could even tell that on a fox, and backed off anyway. Luffy nodded to Naruto but kept watching the giant as he walked towards his battle. It's not about that anymore. Vivi wanted to ask what he meant, but Dory cut in. It's about pride now. He picked up his sword and shield and ran towards the other giant, who was also taking position and charging. And we forgot the reason ages ago, he yelled as they clashed. Shockwaves were sent their way from the force of their collision. Luffy and Vivi were staring at the giants fighting before Luffy fell over backwards onto the ground muttering, "They're huge," while Naruto snickered at his actions. They continued watching as the giants fought. Naruto noticed that they were constantly aiming for each other's vital areas. If even one of those hits hit, they're down for the count. Dory tried to hit the other giant with the tip of his sword as he swung it down at him, but he jumped up and the sword missed. The other giant came down with axe and hit Dory on the head, who had been left defenseless with his sword in the ground. It didn't have much of an effect though, as he was wearing a helmet. Both of them kept exchanging hits, barely missing each other, until finally the both of them swung their shields in a last attempt and were both hit in the face. They collapsed and everybody who was watching held their breath, wanting to know what would happen. Suddenly they started laughing. Gabababa. Hey Dory, I got some good rum from guests, the other giant said. Excellent. I haven't had rum for so long. Pour me some, will ya? Gegyayaha. Nearly everyone's sweat dropped at the display of affection the two had after having tried to kill each other. After the other giant gave Dory a couple of barrels of rum, they both turned around and went back to their respective places on the island. Naruto was laying on the ground while barely listening to the pirates and the giants talking again. He heard something about the log pose taking up a year to get used to the island's field, but he wasn't interested. Building up a bit of his chakra to the surface of his skin, he made it as dense as he could and shot it out onto the island. Over the years he had gotten much better at chakra control, but who wouldn't when it's nearly one of the only things he could practice. The books he had read on Ohara were on different ways of chakra control and chakra manipulation. But because of his huge chakra reserves, he couldn't try the latter until a couple of years ago, after a long time of practice on chakra control. He'd used his imagination for several other techniques and jutsu like the substitution, but it could only get him so far. He'd managed to figure out quite a lot of them though, and had different ways to make up for what he couldn't do just yet. He felt a lot of presences on the island, so he had thinned out his chakra to respond to only those who had more chakra than the amount they need to live off. While outside of the elemental nations, it's rare to meet anyone who has enough chakra to even stand on water. A lot of pirates and marines have a bit more than the average civilian. Still, it would be damn right impossible for most of them to become ninja without starting very early in life. He felt the other giant with 2 other companions. It looked like they were talking, so they were probably the guests he was talking about in their fight. There were 2 other presences walking about the island. He could feel they were Zoro and the curly-browed guy. It looked like they were each fighting against something, but he couldn't really tell against what. The next presence was someone he recognized. What are Mr. 5 and Miss Valentine doing on this island? He felt them walking on the other side of the island. They had probably just arrived. The last presence was that of Mr. 3 and his partner Miss Golden Week. Bingo! He thought, but before he could do anything something exploded. He reacted instantly and took a position ready to fight if needed. Quickly he saw they weren't being attacked. The barrel of rum the giant had been drinking had exploded. Dory-san! Mr. Giant! Luffy and Vivi yelled. Karoo was running circles around them in panic. Naruto had a bad feeling about this, so he went to stand next to Vivi. What happened? Why did the rum explode? Wasn't this rum from our ship? Luffy said, slightly panicked while he was standing on the giant for some reason. It exploded from inside his stomach. Do you think that the other giant? But before she could finish her sentence, Luffy snapped, though not entirely at her. Do you think two warriors who have been fighting for 100 years would stoop that low? Vivi nodded, having to agree with that. Then who could have? She trailed off as the giant behind them stood up. He looked down at them with a dark look on his face. It's you little runts. He coughed a little. Bragi is a proud warrior of Elbaf, and there's nobody but you who could have done it. He had another coughing fit. Blood poured out of his mouth with this one. He grabbed his weapon and glared at the Straw Hat Captain. Vivi was trying to run away and tried to tell Luffy to do the same, but before she could, Naruto bit her shoe to keep her from moving. Vivi looked down and saw him stopping her. Naruto-san. What are you doing? We have to get away from here. Naruto let go and shook his head and with one of his tails pointed to Luffy. Vivi looked and saw Luffy warming up his limbs for a fight. Luffy-san, you can't possibly think of fighting a giant. That's reckless. The size difference is too big. Luffy put down his hat and passed it to Vivi. Hold on to that for me, before turning back to the giant and stretching his knuckles. Sorry Osan, but I'm going to have to shut you up for a bit. Listen to me, Dory-san, we know nothing of that explosive rum. But you should stop fighting, your wounds are going to get worse. Vivi yelled, trying to reason the giant into stopping, but the words fell on deaf ears and both Luffy and the giant continued watching each other for an opening. Naruto took position to help temporarily take out the giant if needed. It was something he could do for Vivi, as a form of payback for scratching his ears and sharing her lunch. Naruto liked to think that he returned every debt he owed as long as he could afford to do so. The only exception being if it involved Robin's safety. Dory was the first to attack. He swung down his sword with so much strength the air that parted pushed away everything around them. Luffy managed to dodge it just barely, even with the wind helping him. The ground where the sword ended up was fissured and ground flew around the clearing from just the force of the swing. The giant's body couldn't handle the pressure and he started to cough up more blood. Luffy took this chance and charged onto the sword, running up towards the giant. Naruto saw where this was heading and he started powering up a smaller version of his Biju Dama, which was a small sphere of chakra so tightly compressed it had a very explosive effect. It was something he thought of when Robin had given him his bandana scarf. He'd eventually figured out how to do it from the chakra manipulation, but somehow it was something he seemed to know almost instinctively, so it didn't take him long to learn. The attack just seemed to come naturally, even if he had only thought of it in recent years. All three of his tails moved in front of his snout with the tips pointed at each other, forming a triangle without actually touching. In between the tails a small black and red ball of energy started to form, slowly getting bigger. Naruto was making sure to keep the power minimal as the power of his Biju Dama could be very dangerous. Vivi was watching the giant and Luffy fight but soon noticed something next to her and she saw the fox powering up some kind of move. Perplexed by seeing the fox do another thing that shouldn't be possible for a fox, she hadn't thought of asking what he was actually doing. I really have to get used to the Grand Line, she thought absently while watching both sides. Luffy was still running up in the sword getting ready to punch the giant in the face, but the giant saw what he was trying to do and raised the other hand with the shield getting ready to pound Luffy before he could hit him. Luffy tried to be quick and hit him anyway, but he was a bit too slow and the shield was already swung towards his face. Getting ready to be hit by the shield, Luffy prepared himself, but before anything happened a big blast of black energy shot past his head hitting the shield. It exploded and pushed it out of the way. The giant was left defenseless by this attack and Luffy took the chance hitting the giant in the face with his Gomu Gomu no pistol attack. The giant was on his way falling but managed to keep standing, shocking everyone there slightly. He is a person who has gained powers of the evil fruit. I underestimated you, Dory said, muttering the first part mostly to himself before coughing up blood as he collapsed. Luffy was panting a lot and sat down trying to gather his breath. Luffy-san, are you alright? Vivi said as she moved closer to Luffy with Naruto behind her. How is the giant? He asked, still sitting on the ground. He is alright. I don't think he would have calmed down unless you did that. Luffy absently nodded. I am very upset about this, the captain suddenly said out of nowhere. Naruto nodded slightly, getting what he meant. As Mr. Giant said, the other giant can't have made the rum explode and I know my friends wouldn't do that. There must be someone else on this island. Luffy said, frowning. He seemed to think about something for a bit. Though as soon as he went quiet he realized something else and turned back to his goofy self. Nay Vivi, what was that cool beam just now? He said, already on his feet, bouncing up and down with sparkles in his eyes. Both Vivi and Naruto's sweat dropped at the change of mood. Well, actually I don't know, Luffy-san, she said as she turned to Naruto. Would you mind telling us, Naruto-kun? He blinked at the honorifics but nodded. He moved to a piece of sand before he stopped. He had a great idea. He retreated back to where he was standing and closed his eyes to concentrate. Naruto-kun, don't you need that sand to write? Vivi asked, confused as to what he was doing. Naruto opened his eyes. They were normally blue-colored, but when he was a fox they turned an amazing fire-like red, which were almost always glowing slightly. On one of his tails a small fire started to burn and he moved it in various ways, slowly leaving a pattern in the places he passed. Seconds after, characters and words started to appear. After he was done he kept his chakra concentrated to make sure it didn't disappear. He moved next to Vivi to look at his work and nodded, satisfied. I am a fox yokai, meaning I have certain powers. That beam-like attack was just some of my energy concentrated together to shoot as a projectile. The message said. Vivi looked at him slightly shocked before noticing something. By the way you wrote it, it's like. That wasn't anything worth noticing. Naruto nodded and moved in front of the both of them. He once more rode in the air using one of his tails. Maybe he'll be able to use this method without moving his tails. A bit. I have a lot of energy, so this wasn't all that big, and other than that I have some other moves I made up. I won't tell though. He put his snout childishly into the air with an arrogant grin to make the last bit slightly more final. Before Vivi could say anything else about that, Luffy decided to enter the conversation. Yelling. Cool, a beam. You've got a beam. Do you want to join my crew? He said out of nowhere. Naruto, who was taken off guard, was once more forced into a hug. Not able to get his bearings, he did what he always did and substituted himself for a log. Luffy, who was suddenly hugging a log, was even more impressed and kept chasing him, yelling at him to become his nakama. Naruto suddenly felt as if he had become prey and was surprised at the feeling. He ran to Vivi and hid behind her. Shit, I'm acting like a small child who's scared of something, but that captain is really weird. He continued to keep up his guard as he watched Luffy making his way towards him with his hands in the air, making creepy movements. Luffy-san, I think you have to calm down, because you're scaring him. Luffy stopped for a bit before continuing to yell at him to join his crew. He stopped attacking him though. He's not scaring me. Naruto thought indignantly, but as the sparkles increased in Luffy's eyes he started to doubt it. Okay, maybe a little, he thought with a sweat drop. He moved out of the spot behind Vivi and just decided to ignore him. But before Luffy could take the chance to hug the fox again, the volcano behind them exploded once more, and seconds after that the giant tried to get up to fight. They all saw what this meant and turned back to the giant, who was now trying to pick himself up. Dory-san, please stop, you're hurt. You should take a rest, otherwise you'll die. Vivi yelled at the giant, who was trying to stand up. I am the warrior Dory, at least. He coughed up even more blood before continuing. I have to fight in the honor of Elbaf, he said as the blood streamed down his mouth. Luffy tried to stop the giant once more, but before he could even move, Dory had put a giant carcass of some kind of dinosaur on top of him, making sure he couldn't move. Naruto, who no longer had any intention of stopping the giant, sat down, having paid back his debt. It was a fight for pride and not something he would interfere in. While Vivi was watching with slight panic in her eyes. The giant stood with his sword pointed down at Luffy. I can't stop, we have been fighting for 100 years and are still fighting. If we begin it, we can't escape from it, or it will mean we stop being warriors. If that happened, I will no longer be myself. If the warrior god of Elbaf had decided for it to be this way, then let it be, the giant continued. But Luffy wasn't listening to what the giant was saying. But it isn't fair. Someone else was involved in this fight. But the giant kept walking towards the battle. Shut up, you who were born 10 or 20 years ago, you know nothing of the highest honor of Elbaf. That was when Luffy snapped. So if your god told you to die, you would? But his yelling fell on deaf ears. Naruto turned away from the scene. He wrote something next to Vivi to let her know where he went. She was really nice and Naruto didn't really fancy the thought of her dying later. Hell, he didn't like the thought of any of those pirates dying later. They were all very interesting, and compared to Baroque works they were actually really decent people. This was still his job though for now, and Robin would always be his priority. He left the clearing and prepared himself to complete his mission. Naruto had to get to Mr. 3 before the man interrupted the fight between the giants. Naruto knew the way in which Mr. 3 operated his plans. He probably wouldn't interfere with anything until it was exactly the right time. Which in this case was when the giants had fought or were tired. If he was quick, then he could probably still find the man before he tried anything. He had his mission and he would finish it. Naruto ran into the forest and transformed back into his human form. Sending out a pulse of chakra, he figured out the location of Mr. 3 and moved towards that direction. He reached the place quickly because of his speed and stopped in front of a small, square house. It was white in color. Probably made of Mr. 3's Doru Doru no Mi power. Naruto mused absently while observing the odd contraption. He walked over to the window and rested his elbows on it, looking into the house. Between fights, if you're not concentrating, you will lose. Right now their concentration is running out. All because of the bomb of an invisible enemy. He heard Mr. 3 say. Remembering the giants and their Naruto could actually feel a bit of anger on their behalf. They were the ones who put the bomb there. Mr. 3 really is a sneaky little rat. Almost immediately he suppressed the emotion and took on a neutral facade. He was on the same side as them and had done similar things throughout the years. They were hardly ever his own decisions though. He preferred a quick end if he had to, not prolonging any pain. That was just torture. Something he wasn't very fond of. Naruto continued to listen as Mr. 3 explained his plans to Mr. 5, Miss Valentine and Miss Golden Week. Our first target is the green giant Dory. I knew the bomb wouldn't kill him. However, it should have some effect on him from inside his body. There won't be any trouble taking care of him. Besides, this is a good time. They're just starting to fight. They're just silly fighters after all. As long as we have a non-face-to-face battle with them, everything should be fine. Naruto decided that this was a good moment to interrupt, and he entered the little house through the window quietly, though nobody actually saw him enter. And Mr. 3, what about your non-face-to-face contact with the boss? Everyone turned to him, shocked about him standing there. As soon as they got out of their stupor, they took offensive positions ready to attack. Naruto gave them a huge grin before turning to Mr. 3 a bit more seriously. My codename is Mr. Black. Mr. 3, you have failed to keep contact with the boss, and as such I am to take appropriate measures, of which I was left to decide on. Do you have anything to say? Naruto watched as the color paled out of all their faces, though surprisingly Mr. 5 was the first to react. Mr. Black, as in one of the unluckies directly serving under the boss, the one nobody has seen before? The man seemed mostly shocked, but there was an undercurrent of fear visible. Naruto nodded slightly and gave Mr. 3 a meaningful stare, telling him to hurry up. Mr. 3 shook his head to shake away the shock and turned to explain. Before I will tell you why, may I inquire the reason and if there is any chance of my survival? He asked with a sliver of growing of hope in his voice. Naruto nodded. Do you mean the reason as to why I was left to decide? Getting a nod in confirmation from Mr. 3. Well, it won't matter too much now if I tell you, but soon you will all be gathered. Boss's plan will finally be put into action and he is busy, as such I was left to do the menial work. As for whether you'll survive depends on you. Mr. 3 sighed slightly and nodded. Okay. He sighed, composing himself. Miss Golden Week and I were enjoying our time on Holiday Island because I had received no orders from the boss. I told Miss Golden Week and she told me almost immediately she had received an order. When I asked her why she didn't tell me, she told me I never asked. Everyone in the room sweat dropped except for Naruto. He kept his professional attitude and motioned for the man to continue his story. He was sweat dropping on the inside though. I read the mission and it said to get rid of those who discovered his identity. He took out the drawings, showing Luffy, Zoro, Nami and Vivi. We immediately headed to Little Garden, hoping to make up for the lost time, or at least I was. He said, glaring at Miss Golden Week, who was now nodding away into a deep sleep. But anyway, we arrived here and I saw that the two giants were here fighting it out and that they had quite the bounties on their heads. Taking them on together with the targets would be quite difficult, so I started to plan. I called Mr. 5 and Miss Valentine for help. In all of this chaos I had forgotten to contact the boss. But I assure you when I finish this I will personally apologize to the boss, of course not face to face though, and present him the money the giants will get us. Naruto didn't exactly want to acknowledge the idea considering he quite liked the giant, but deciding from a neutral perspective as a Baroque Works agent it seemed like the most logical choice to let him try. Okay. I will allow you this one chance. But screw this up, I will eliminate you and inform the boss of the situation here. He said, allowing for some killing intent to leak into his voice. Mr. 3 and everyone else in this room nodded, the color draining out of their faces, looking quite scared. This is your last chance. Naruto left the room and ran into the forest, leaving them shocked in the little wax house. Once he was in the forest he turned back into a fox. I'm going to have to be here until he finishes or fails his mission, so why not enjoy it? He thought with a smug smile before moving at a more leisurely pace through the forest. His route? Back to the Straw Hat Captain and the princess. Probably the most interesting place on the island. He took his time strolling through the forest, avoiding any dinosaur or animal that would want to attack him. He was captivated by the dinosaurs though. He had heard Robin speak of them before, but he hadn't thought they would be quite this big. According to his memory, He had seen a couple of Apatosaurus and a Tyrannosaurus Rex, though he had avoided the last one. It would probably be an interesting encounter, but he didn't fancy fighting such colossal animal. After 10 minutes of strolling through the forest, he finally reached the clearing again, only to find Luffy under a carcass, half burned. The long-nosed guy he had seen when he was with Robin on their boat was on the floor. Naruto thought the guy's name was Apod, or Usopp or something. The last rather obvious thing he noticed was the giant spot-billed duck unconscious on the floor. Vivi and giants were nowhere in sight. He trotted towards them but walked past most of them, heading straight for the straw hat that lay a couple of meters away from Luffy. He picked the hat up with his mouth and moved back to the straw hat captain and put the hat on top of his head. He had remembered how much the hat had meant to the guy, and he could understand the sentimental worth. He himself felt the same for the bandana he received from Robin. He was about to leave when Luffy grabbed onto one of his tails. Naruto froze entirely and wondered why he was being grabbed, hugged and stroked so much today. Also why he kept letting his guard down, essentially allowing them to. He turned around to Luffy, who was waking up while holding his tails. Suddenly Luffy squeezed hard on his tail and he let out a pathetic yelp. That was when he had enough and scratched Luffy in the face, waking him up. "Ooh Fox. What did you do that for?" Naruto pointed with his snout towards the captain's hands and Luffy followed the motion. "Ooh, sorry." He chuckled while letting go of his tail. Naruto concentrated on his chakra as he wasn't yet used to using it in that particular way and rode in the air using with the fiery letters. "What happened?" Luffy looked around him and saw Usopp and Karoo lying there. Naruto could see him get mad but hadn't quite expected him to do what he did next. Luffy forced the giant carcass of his back with all his might and stood up. Giant Osan went to fight anyway and lost, even though it was unfair. After then the bomb guy came and beat us all up, taking Vivi with him. He walked to Usopp and pulled him out of the ground by the nose and then towards Karoo to ask him if he wanted to help Vivi. The spot-billed duck nodded vigorously and stood up once more. Naruto watched as each of them stood up before they all started to run into the forest, yelling out something about payback. "Really though, I doubt this will actually work." Naruto chirped loudly and pulled the attention towards himself before they all disappeared off into the forest. After they all stopped moving to look his way, Naruto sighed a bit and walked to Luffy, who was looking towards him curiously. "What is it, Fox?" Naruto lit up one of his tails while Usopp was watching with a mixture of surprise and fright. "Seriously, he's scared of a fox? Never seen that before. I guess I am somewhat bigger than a normal fox," Naruto thought as he continued to write. "Do you even know where they are?" At that everyone looked at Luffy, who started to laugh sheepishly. "Nope," he exclaimed loudly, causing everyone to groan at his stupidity. "So Luffy, you were just planning to run around until we found them?" the long-nosed guy asked. "Yep." Everyone sighed and Naruto barked once more to get the attention. This time it took less than a few seconds for the sentence to appear. "Why don't you look at where the giant collapsed? Maybe they're all there, or the giant might know where the rest are." And before he could say or write anything else, they were already running, again. Naruto laughed quietly at the way they acted and started to follow them. He mostly kept to the shadows though, his job wasn't to help them. If he wanted to he could, nobody knew he was Mr. Black at the moment. But if he did help them he would have to do it discreetly, otherwise he would end up as a target, and that might be a bit annoying. One half of him would be a target of the same organization his other half worked for. After running at their pace for 10 minutes he finally reached the clearing where the giant was supposed to be. Naruto jumped into a tree to witness and plan what he was going to do. Also of course to watch with amusement as all three of the others charged into the clearing as if they owned the place. He was lucky he was a fox at the moment, otherwise he'd have trouble stifling his own laughter. Luffy, the long-nosed guy and Karoo all ran into the clearing, but they had built up such a momentum they ran past the enemy as they were watching. Each and every one of them crashed into the forest as the enemy was wondering what it was exactly that ran past them in the first place. "Let's take care of them, Usopp." "Duck!" Luffy yelled as they all stood up from their crash. Luffy, Usopp, Karoo, Nami and Vivi yelled happily at them while Zoro stared indifferently. "Bragi-sensei, I will take revenge for you," Usopp yelled while the giant was strapped to the ground. "Usopp?" the giant said, surprised. Naruto looked at the two giants. One of them was unconscious on the ground. By the flesh wound on his chest it was obvious he had lost against his rival. The other giant, Bragi, though wasn't celebrating, he was tied to the ground with wax around his wrists and ankles. 4 wax knives cut deep into his hands and feet, keeping him from struggling too much. Horrible, Naruto thought. He didn't like cowardly methods like these, and unless it was to protect someone he would never resort to them. Maybe even then he wouldn't. He'd probably just leave with Robin. Despite her sense of humor, she wasn't much of a fan to actual gore and torture. Nami was telling Luffy and the rest to beat up those guys and Luffy agreed. But before he could even start to fight, something else caught his eye. To the rubber captain this little detail seemed to be more important than anything else. Whoa, look at his hair, it looks really stupid, he yelled, pointing at Mr. Three's hairdo. While Luffy's priorities might not be entirely in the right order, he did have a point. The man's hair was literally tied up in the form of a 3. Mr. 3 grew a tick mark on his forehead. Shut up, he muttered, but Luffy just continued on. And that 3, it's on fire. Shut up, Mr. 3 yelled as Luffy continued to make fun of his hairdo. Luffy, can you break this thing for us first before we become candle dolls? Nami yelled while pointing at the giant sculpture above them. They were all stuck, or rather their feet were stuck on a wax cake with a giant pumpkin spinning above them. The pumpkin had candle-like things which were on fire, causing little bits of wax to fall down to the cake where they were held. Are you guys in trouble? Luffy asked suddenly, hearing Nami. Zoro looked at Luffy and shrugged. No, not really. But the blood streaming down his ankles was saying something entirely different. Naruto jumped to another tree without anyone noticing to get a better look at the entire clearing. Zoro, there's a lot of blood coming from your legs, you know, Nami said almost casually, hardly worrying for some unfathomable reason. Zoro just shrugged. Yeah, I cut half my ankles just now before Luffy arrived. He answered just as casually. Idiot, why would you cut your own legs? Are you an idiot? Anyway, do something about them, it's almost painful to look at. Nami and Zoro started to bicker more about how painful it looked and that he should do something about it, while Vivi was looking at them surprised. Maybe with a bit of disbelief added to it. How come you're not worried at all? She asked them. They turned their heads to her. Zoro just shrugged and Nami smiled slightly. Don't worry, even though Luffy is like that, when something needs to get done he will get it done. Vivi was even more surprised at the amount of trust they showed and smiled slightly. Naruto couldn't quite suppress a smile as well. These guys really didn't act like the stereotype pirates at all. They were more like adventurers, although adventurers nowadays are also mostly pirates. The government almost always declared them as such. I bet Robin would really like these guys. He thought for a moment. He didn't entertain the thought for long though. They had met people similar to them before and you could never really tell when you would be betrayed. Naruto would probably never stop trusting people, but he wouldn't risk Robin's safety. Experience had told them that their bounties and reputation were worth a lot of trouble that most just weren't willing to go through. He turned his attention back to the fight and heard Zoro say something. Anyway, Luffy, can you destroy that pole? I'll take care of the rest. He smirked broadly as Luffy grinned just as widely. Sure. He got into a fighting stance. Luffy, we'll help you from behind, don't worry, Usopp yelled in a confident-sounding manner from near the edge of the forest. More like you're too scared to fight, Naruto thought as he watched the duck and Usopp hide behind a tree with buckling knees. Luffy was slightly distracted and turned around to see who was talking to him. But Mr. 3 made use of that distraction. Candle lock, he yelled as he threw wax at Luffy, catching his legs into a block of wax, keeping his legs together. He's caught, Luffy-san, Usopp and Vivi yelled, watching Luffy as he lay on his back. Luffy himself though was knocking the wax to see how hard it was. What's this? My legs look like a hammer, and you could practically see his face light up with an idea. You really suck, next will be your arms, Mr. 3 yelled, smiling. He didn't notice Luffy realized something and yelled, Candle lock. But Luffy managed to dodge the attack and grabbed one of the daggers, holding the giant's hand to the ground. He wrapped his arms around the handle of the dagger several times. After he was twisted around the hilt thoroughly, his rubber tendencies kicked back in and he was sent back the opposite way he came in. Picking up speed as he twisted back around the hilt, he moved his legs to conveniently look similar to a hammer and hit the pole holding the pumpkin in the air. While the idea was sound, the captain hadn't quite anticipated what would happen after he'd kicked away the support holding up the entire pumpkin. The hammer on his legs was destroyed as the support fell away from underneath the entire structure and the pumpkin fell down onto the cake-like structure, only to continue spinning as it let off more small pieces of wax that floated down. Luffy looked towards the cake and saw all of them still there, stuck. That was dangerous. Why didn't you all move? He said, not noticing the frustrated and shocked expression his crew members and semi-crew members were wearing. It didn't take long for anger to over among those stuck on the cake. How can we move when we're stuck in wax? They all yelled simultaneously. Luffy though just laughed and put on his usual smile. Why didn't you tell me? You only told me to destroy the pole, he said, totally clueless about the actual goal. Mr. Bushido, are you sure it's okay to leave it in his hands? Vivi said to her neighbor Zoro while he himself was having doubts too. Mr. Bushido, that's the name she has for him? Well, it fits him. Especially after trying to cut his own legs off trying to escape. Naruto thought absently as he watched what was happening. I guess I should help them a bit, besides it's supposed to be quite painful dying from wax, and Vivi was the reason I discovered another way of communicating while I'm a fox. He was about to step forward when he realized something with sudden clarity. Damn it, I'm already starting to like them. I really should leave after helping them a bit. I'll help them escape and then Mr. 3 will probably disappear. I'll report to Crocodile that he escaped and everything will be fine. I hope. He jumped down his tree and moved behind the giant candle construction, still deciding on what to do when he saw something from the corner of his eyes. Usopp was trying to shoot Mr. 3 with his small-sized catapult slingshot. He shot something and yelled, "Explosive bullet!" But before it reached Mr. 3, Mr. 5 jumped in and ate the bullet-like object. The man swallowed it and seconds later it exploded inside his stomach. Smoke left his ears and mouth. The method reminded Naruto of a teapot that finished boiling water. The man sighed in satisfaction as the entire process was done, though that quickly changed to a frown. Disgusting, you're using low-quality gunpowder, aren't you? Mr. 5 started walking towards Usopp with an evil grin on his face with Miss Valentine followed floating in the air. Usopp, sensing the danger, jumped on the Karu's back and both of them ran into the forest with Mr. 5 and Miss Valentine following them. Seeing the chance, Naruto used his speed to climb the wax construction unnoticed and was now standing behind Zoro still unnoticed. Miss Goldenweek was eating senbei and green tea while watching Luffy and Mr. 3 with her back towards the wax sculpture. Mr. 3 and Luffy were too busy fighting to notice him. Okay. I just have to destroy the giant pumpkin, right? Luffy shot his arms behind him and like rubber they shot back in front of him with tremendous power behind them. Gomu Gomu no. But before he could hit his target, Mr. 3 out up a wax barrier blocking the way, candle wall, bazooka, and they both blocked each other. Would you quit getting involved? Luffy yelled frustrated. I'm the one who should be saying that. Stop interrupting my art process. He took on his stance once more, candle lock. Luffy tried to dodge but seemed to have an idea and slowed down, allowing one of his hands to be hit. Haha, got another hammer. He smiled widely. Mr. 3, who saw what he had done, quickly put up another wall. Damn. Candle wall. Gomu Gomu no. Luffy yelled once more as his arm stretched behind him. Hammer. The candle wall shattered and Luffy hit Mr. 3 straight in the face. In the meantime, Naruto walked behind Zoro and poured some chakra in his claws, sharpening them. He slashed the wax quickly and saw it wasn't as hard as he thought it would be. It already had come loose from him just slashing it a few times. He tried to give it another try, but while he was concentrating he was picked up by the neck like some kind of cat. What the hell is wrong with me? I can normally sense someone coming from a mile away and these guys are picking me up, petting me and grabbing my tails like I'm some kind of cat. He thought, reprimanding himself for letting down his guard once again. Was this really going to become a habit? What's this? Zoro said as he picked up the three-tailed fox by the scruff. Vivi turned to him and smiled. Naruto-kun, you came to help us. She exclaimed. Naruto turned his face away from her, pouting. One of his tails lit up and text started to appear. He figured if it was the chakra doing the work he could probably do it without moving his tail, and it seemed to work. You seem to be in trouble, so I thought I'd try and help without anyone noticing, but Mr. Bushido, was it, decided to blow my cover. He had written. Zoro and Nami were surprised that Vivi knew the fox, but even more so when it communicated with them. Vivi, who is this and why is it helping us? Nami said while a tick mark appeared on Naruto's head. Please refrain from calling me in it as I'm perfectly capable of understanding you. He wrote down almost immediately, using polite words on purpose to show his point. Vivi smiled in a somewhat sympathetic way. This is Naruto-kun. We met him when we were with Dori-san. He's a fox yokai apparently. Nami seemed startled and slightly frightened by Vivi casually mentioning a yokai. Zoro looked interested and continued to hold on to Naruto by the scruff. Naruto himself rolled his eyes at Nami and glared at Zoro, who laughed. Feisty little fox we have here. That's it. He hit one of Zoro's hand with one of his tails, making the man let go. The fox landed on the wax cake and turned to look up from his position down on the ground. I am not a small fox. Heck, I'm much bigger in size compared to most foxes, and I'm probably older than all of you. He wrote, irritated, not caring if he revealed any information about himself. Zoro snorted. Yeah right, I'm 19. I'm pretty sure foxes don't even live that long. Naruto rolled his eyes once more, but at Zoro's obliviousness this time. Hello? Fox yokai here, if anyone has noticed. Besides, if that's the case, I'm a decade older than you are. He wrote while smirking for a bit. Naruto snickered a bit as Zoro muttered under his breath about stupid foxes in frustration. Not being right probably annoyed him just as much as being outwitted by what he thought to be a fox. Anyway, what are you doing here? Nami suddenly said, gaining the attention. Naruto repeated what he had written earlier. As I already wrote, I came to help you. Nami glared at the fox slightly, but by now she seemed mostly curious and less frightened. And why would you? From what I've understood, you only just met Vivi and were strangers. Naruto nodded, conceding her that point. Well, why not? Vivi kind of helped me figure out this new way of communicating. Not even 2 hours ago I had to go find sand to write in. That's extremely annoying to do when you want to communicate with a human. Other than that, Vivi and Luffy were nice to me. Most people react like you did when they hear I'm something of a yokai, he wrote as a matter of fact. Nami got a little red in the face after reading the last part and muttered a quiet sorry, though he heard it. Apology accepted. Now can I help, or is there anything else I need to explain? Everyone shook their head and Naruto closed his eyes once more, concentrating his chakra. Zoro watched curiously at what the fox would do while the other two were simply waiting for it to happen. Naruto slowly opened his eyes and raised his chakra-enhanced claw, slashing down at the wax surrounding Zoro's feet. Within a moment Zoro's feet were loose, though still surrounded by wax. That's a pretty cool trick, the swordsman said. Zoro jumped of the cake to join the battle but buckled under his own weight as his feet were still wounded and cursed. I guess I can't join the battle just yet. The giant, who had been quietly watching what was happening, was surprised at what the fox could do. That's pretty cool trick, little Kyuubi, the giant said with a knowing glint in his eyes. Naruto couldn't help but flinch slightly at the casual use of the term, but he continued to slash at the wax surrounding Nami and Vivi's legs. Nobody but the giant and Zoro noticed the flinch the fox had given. As soon as Naruto was done, Vivi and Nami tried to move away from the sculpture but found they could no longer move. Naruto noticed this and gave Vivi a small abrupt push in the back, causing her to fall of the sculpture. Vivi, who was startled by the sudden push, let out a small yelp, but she was quickly caught by a very surprised Zoro. What the hell did ya do that for, fox? Zoro yelled. You caught her, didn't you? Naruto wrote, snickering. He would have caught her even if Zoro hadn't, but he wasn't about to tell them that. Next he moved to give Nami, who was saying that she didn't want to, desperately. He didn't really pay her any attention though, and with one push, she fell down. She too was caught by Zoro, who had been ready this time. Naruto jumped after them and landed next to them on the ground. So what are we going to do? I still can't move, Nami said while Vivi made an agreeing sound. Well, I can melt all the wax, but since there is wax inside your bodies you're going to have stomach aches later today, Naruto wrote with a slight apologetic tone to it. Everyone sighed when they read this, but pretty much all nodded in agreement. Okay, but how are you going to melt the wax? Vivi asked curiously. Naruto gave a knowing smile. Well, as far as a fox could give one, and wrote something down before the tips of his tails burst into flames. I'm a fox yokai, ever heard of foxfire? He wrote down. But they were all too busy staring at the fox in flames and some nervous at the thought of that fire touching them. Naruto was glowing slightly thanks to the fires on his tails, causing his yellow fur to shine a bright yellow with orange tint. The fire on his tails were an amazing red and the heat started to melt the wax. Bit by bit all of the remaining wax was dripping onto the ground. Surprisingly, none of them felt the heat of the fire directly. Why aren't we getting burned? Vivi asked, just as surprised as the rest. This foxfire is my energy. I can do with it what I want and thus decide what it touches and what it doesn't, he wrote down. After he was done he turned around and started to leave. Wait, where are you going? Zoro asked, annoyed that he had a debt to the fox but at the same time interested by its skills. Well, it seems your captain has defeated the candle guy temporarily and I'm not waiting here for him to start hugging me again, he wrote with a bit of snarl on his face. Vivi could only sweat drop at the brief message while Zoro and Nami had no idea what was going on and turned to Vivi for clarification. Luffy-san saw what Naruto-san could do and started asking him to join his crew, while hugging him to death. All of them sweat dropped at the thought before Naruto added something to her explanation. And after you got kidnapped he nearly crushed one of my tails in his hands, Naruto said, walking away at a normal pace. What Naruto once again managed to underestimate was the crew of the man who had managed to escape his guard. Who was to say the rest couldn't do so either? Once again he didn't notice was the slight smirk all three of them shared after glancing at each other slightly. They all sneaked up behind him and again before he could actually react he could feel some force keeping him from continuing on the path he'd been going. Zoro had once again grabbed him by the scruff while Vivi and Nami were holding onto his tails. Sorry Naruto-kun, Vivi said with a slight apologetic smile on her face. It didn't quite portray her regret though. Naruto could see a mischievous glint in her eyes, shared by Nami and strangely enough Zoro. Naruto sighed in acquiescence. I'm older than you guys, so why'd I have to be treated like some kid? Though all of them chuckled at the small joke. Well, our captain wouldn't like for his potential crewmate to disappear. Knowing him he'll chase you until the end of the world. Especially if he hasn't had an answer, and we are going to prevent that. None of them admitting they were starting to like the fox. Well, I guess I could stay for a bit, but only if you let go. I'm not going to stay if you keep holding on to me like that, and believe me it's quite easy for me to get away from you, he wrote in the air, giving them a pointed look. Most of them nodded and he was let go one by one. Thank you. Now I suggest you help your captain as he seems to be getting himself into quite a bit of trouble. As he said, Luffy was on the ground laughing himself to death. It was a very odd scene to watch, but it became even stranger when they saw this Usopp hitching a ride on Karoo and hit Luffy on the back with an explosive bullet. Usopp, why are you hitting Luffy? Nami yelled. Usopp, who was being chased by Mr. Five and Miss Valentine, could only yell a short answer before he entered the forest once more. That girl's devil fruit is preventing Luffy from fighting. As he said that, they saw the girl standing there with her palette mixing colors. Warai no Kiro and Kaneshimi no Owl form. She was mixing the colors together on her palette, and after she had mixed the colors she spun around once, forming a strange symbol in the air. Color trap. Nagomi no Midori. She said while the symbol hit Luffy on his now bare back. As the symbol hit his back, Luffy stopped moving and joined the girl eating senbei, extremely relaxed, unnaturally relaxed. The girl was drinking her tea and Luffy was also getting some tea from her. You're too relaxed, Luffy. Nami, Vivi and Zoro all yelled at their captain, but they stopped as they saw Luffy struggling against the technique. Zoro, who couldn't do anything with his legs, was trying to force them, but Naruto jumped onto his back, pushing him back to the ground, forcing Zoro to stay on the ground. He himself was a bit embarrassed at having to do so, but if it stopped the swordsman from moving, he didn't quite mind it as much. I really am getting too involved in this, he thought with a sigh. He rode in the air in front of Vivi and Nami, telling them to help Luffy as Zoro would hurt himself worse by trying to. Ha, Fox. What are you doing? Get off, Zoro exclaimed, annoyed, but Naruto shook his head and pointed with his snout towards his legs. It's just a wound, it will heal afterwards, Zoro said, but Naruto shook his head adamantly and stood up, daring the swordsman to stand up with his glare. The swordsman stared back for a bit before sighing and turned around to watch what the fox would do. Naruto walked in front of him and sat down, using his tails to position one of Zoro's legs in front of him, and pointed to the wound. This is serious. The amount of blood you have lost isn't dangerous in itself, but should you continue to fight and run as you normally do, you'll damage the nerves. You might never be able to walk again, thus ending your life as a swordsman. You should be able to walk, but no fighting, running and training that requires pressure on the feet. Zoro's eyes slowly widened as he read the message. He opened his mouth to say something else but waited when letter continued to appear before him. Don't worry, as of now it's 5 against 4, not counting me, you and the giant. And if you allow me to leave, without having to worry about you recklessly standing up, I can also free the giant and have him help. Giants are much sturdier, so his hands won't have too much damage he can't handle. Zoro, who was slightly overwhelmed with the information, just nodded and sat back down, giving into the threat as he watched Nami and Vivi helping Luffy get free. They weren't succeeding. At first the girl didn't seem to be too dangerous, she was just distracting them with her powers. Why would she distract them? Surely she can attack in some way, Naruto thought as he continued watching. Naruto walked towards the giant and remembered what the giant had called him earlier. Little Kyuubi. How does he know that term? It's supposed to be a term only used in the elemental nations. Almost all knowledge to do with chakra was confined to the elemental nations now. Over time he'd even learned that most common knowledge from his home was banned by the government, mostly folklores for some reason, that an extensive knowledge on chakra theory. He moved towards the giant and decided not to think about it too much. He concentrated his chakra to his claws and ran towards the giant, cutting his first hand loose in a couple of moves. Hey little Kyuubi, causing Naruto to flinch again slightly. Ha, sorry, guess that term isn't a good one for ya, huh? The giant said as he looked at the relatively small fox. Naruto looked at him slightly before he continued running to the next dagger, again pushing his chakra to his claws. He first slashed the second dagger, one that held the giant's hand, to pieces, allowing for some relief before he shattered the other holds on his arms. He moved to the back and did the same to the wax on his feet before returning to where the first hand had been held. Thanks, little fox, the giant said while he massaged his hurt hands. I appreciate it. Naruto nodded before writing something again. Why do you know that term? Nobody uses that, except for the people there. He wrote, stressing, there, in his mind. The giant laughed and everyone on the clearing heard, most of them relieved to hear the giant laughing, while some were panicking that everything was turning out wrong. We giants live much longer, and as such information is also held for that much longer. Most giants recognize the language at least, and some still speak it. I assume you are from there then? He inquired, but Naruto turned away. He nodded slightly before turning back to where Zoro was standing. He didn't see the giant looking at him with a slightly sad smile. Why is a fox yokai from the elemental nation here? I thought they were nearly all gone now. He will have a hard time if anyone who knows more about his species discovers him, the giant thought before turning his thoughts back to his giant friend. Naruto walked back to Zoro and sat down next to him. How is it going with them? he asked, seeing Zoro fidget and scowl. He finally couldn't seem to handle it any longer when Naruto asked. I can't stand watching this. Luffy is still drinking tea. Vivi was hit by that Kaneshimi no Ao or something and can't stop crying, and Nami was hit by Warai no Kiro, was it? And can't stop laughing. Damn, it's embarrassing to watch this fight. And that kid is just sitting there drinking tea and eating senbei. Zoro said, actually turning a frustrating red from watching it. Naruto laughed as he heard Zoro get so frustrated yet not breaking his promise as he kept to the ground. Zoro glared at the fox, which caused Naruto to laugh even harder. You're amazing, you know that. Being that frustrated but still keeping your promise? Zoro calmed down slightly and shrugged, turning a bit more serious. Well, I have got a debt to you to pay off. Naruto tilted his head in confusion. Zoro sighed for a bit before elaborating, you helped us out of that wax thing. Naruto nodded, now understanding. Thanks, Zoro added. Almost as soon as he said this, Naruto turned his own shade of red. He wasn't very used to getting compliments from anyone but Robin. He used to turn red around her when he was small, but they had gotten used to each other's presence and weren't bothered by something like that anymore. Besides, he had always been the more emotionally compromised of the two. Robin could easily keep a stoic facade, but Naruto often let his emotion influence his decisions. He did manage to keep it to a minimum though in this business to make sure nothing bothered him too much, so why was it this crew took it off so easily? Zoro saw the fox turning an awkward shade of orange-red and laughed. Foxes can turn red too, didn't know that. And laughed even more when Naruto buried his head under his paws. Zoro laughed but kept an eye on the battle. Hey, isn't it time to do something? They really aren't going to win like that. Naruto raised his head, calming slightly, and also watched the battle, or rather the relaxing tea party. They had now all been hit by Nagomi no Midori and were having a peaceful tea time with senbei and green tea. Zoro pondered for a moment and Naruto watched. How would she draw if that palette wasn't there? I mean, I can't do anything, but it doesn't feel right attacking someone who isn't doing any damage, Zoro said. Naruto nodded, agreeing with the swordsman. I doubt she can draw without drawing supplies. So how are we going to separate it from her, without getting caught in that color trap? Naruto stood up and walked a bit in front of Zoro to make sure he wasn't in the way. I've got an idea. Does it matter if the palette gets destroyed? Naruto asked Zoro. Zoro just shook his head and watched, interested in what the fox was going to do. Naruto sat down and moved his tails in front of his snout, the tips forming a small triangle without touching each other. He concentrated a small amount of chakra into the tips and a small Biju Dama started to form. Zoro watched interestedly as he wondered what such a small thing could do. Naruto concentrated to make it the least dangerous he could, making sure it only destroyed the palette. He sent a pulse out to check for anyone else and sensed Usopp somewhere behind him. Having checked for any unanticipated variables, he shot the Biju Dama towards the girl and hit the palette, burning it while passing by the girl. No damage was done to her hands in the process. His aim was just that good. The Biju Dama kept going into the forest, where it burned down a few trees. Everyone was surprised by the abrupt happening. Vivi had already seen it before and wasn't as surprised, because almost of them were still under the effect of the color trap, though they couldn't quite show their surprise physically. Miss Golden Week was shocked herself and looked down to her hands, noticing her palette was no longer in her hands. She didn't quite react in a way anyone had expected though. She started to cry. For some reason the effect of the color trap was released when she started crying, and Nami, Vivi and Luffy all shook out of their relaxed state. Luffy though had been so relaxed he had fallen asleep during the process. Naruto, who was feeling a bit guilty, walked over to the girl. Sorry, but I said I would protect them and I don't go back on my word. If you don't mind me asking, why are you doing this anyway? He was careful not to show he knew anything about Baroque works in particular. The girl sniffed and looked at the fox in front of her. Don't know, she said, slowly returning back into her laid-back character, but still sniffing a bit. I guess I was bored. Naruto's sweat dropped slightly at that answer. Joining a criminal organization because she was bored. Talk about laid back, he thought briefly. You like painting? He asked. She nodded slightly, still sniffing. Then why don't you become a painter? With your skills you could even do some bounty hunting to make some money if you're bored, and with your painting skills I bet you could do both of them. He wrote and snickered a bit when he saw her eyes widen in realization. Yeah, I could do that. That sounds really great actually. She smiled and hugged him a bit. Yeah, I saw that one coming. So why is it so different with the Straw Hat Pirates? He thought absently as he let the little girl hug him for a bit. Well, I am fluffy as a fox, so I can understand wanting to hug though. Robin often did it when he was a fox, but that was mostly out of habit from when they were small. Oh, and because apparently he had lovely fur as a fox. He resented that though. If anything, he would call his fur handsome, not lovely, something more manly. She slowly let go and looked him in the eyes. Thanks, Mr. Fox. she said as she smiled brightly, not a laid-back one. If I ever hear from you again and you need something, just ask. Tell them, she pointed to the pirates. Sorry, I didn't really want to hurt them, that was Mr. Three's job. Naruto nodded and she stood up and walked back into the forest. Naruto shortly wondered how she would defend herself, but by the way she walked she probably knew some sort of martial arts. He walked back to where Zoro was sitting and sighed while everyone was staring at him perplexed. What did you do? She just started crying. Nami said, utterly confused. She was upset that her palate broke, then she told me she was bored so she joined those guys, and lastly I gave her a suggestion to become painter and she really looked like she had never considered the option. So she left to pursue that goal. He wrote to her before he sat down next to Zoro. Nami then turned to Zoro. And why are you sitting there all comfy? She said with a smile on her face, though it looked really demonic to most of them. Zoro had an apprehensive look on his face and tried to smile just a bit. Sorry, but I couldn't help, or rather I wasn't allowed by the fox. This time he was glaring at the fox. Naruto-kun didn't let you. Why? Vivi asked before Nami could do so herself. Zoro sighed and pointed to his legs. According to Foxy here, if I try to move my legs in any way intently, I'll damage the nerves and I'll probably never be able to walk again. So I am not allowed to run or fight. Walking seems to allowed, but Foxy here won't allow it yet as he says I'll go and fight. Vivi nodded and Naruto glared at the nickname. Peeved. Your fault for trying to cut your own legs, Nami said pointing at Zoro. Naruto looked at Zoro unbelievingly. You tried to cut your own legs? Zoro smirked. Yeah, well, had to escape in some way, didn't I? Naruto gaped at Zoro. You're a real idiot, an actual one. Even I'm not that stupid. He wrote as Nami started laughing while Zoro gained a tick mark. By the way, where is Usopp-san? Vivi asked and everyone turned to her. Naruto sent out a quick burst of chakra and saw Usopp and Karoo standing next to two people on the ground. Naruto barked once and pointed towards the forest in a direction. Is Usopp there? Nami asked and he nodded. They started to move towards the place he pointed, but seconds later Usopp came riding on Karoo. Ha ha ha. The great Usopp-sama has defeated the enemy, he exclaimed in his bruised, burned and hurt state. He looked over the clearing and saw everyone was barely hurt, except for Zoro, but that was self-inflicted. Ah. Why is everyone fine and I'm totally battered? He said. Everyone noticed what he was talking about and burst out laughing. Usopp-san, you managed to beat both of them? Vivi asked shocked. Yeah, the great Usopp-sama has beaten both of them, but as soon as he said that he was hit on the head by Karoo. Well, Karoo also helped me a lot. As he started to tell how he beat them in a grand manner. Really, he was just telling them he made the bomb guy eat Tabasco, after which he fainted, while the girl tried to crush him with her weight but failing and landing on a piece of rock and hit her head. They all laughed as he told them his story, lying half of the time. Whoa, where are you, candle guy? They suddenly heard. Luffy was waking up and looked around him half asleep. Where's the candle guy? Everyone looked around them and saw he wasn't laying where he was supposed to be. Well, it's easier for me to explain if he actually escaped, Naruto thought, not really interested or worried. Luffy, the fight is over, we won, Nami said, and Luffy looked around once more, but this time his stare landed on Naruto. The fox realized what this meant, tried to run away only to be held by the tail by Zoro, who was smirking brightly. Told ya, you won't be getting away. Naruto could feel his fur stand up and watched anxiously as Luffy got closer. Fox. Join my crew, the captain yelled as he started to run towards Naruto. The fox himself was close to panicking and instinctively used the substitution jutsu, replacing himself with Usopp, who was now as a result being grabbed by Zoro and pounced by Luffy. Meanwhile, Naruto had perched himself on Karoo's back. He chirped something in Karoo's ear and the duck quacked in agreement before running to the other side of the clearing to get away from the rubber man. Everyone was laughing as Naruto and Karoo tried their best to avoid Luffy. U-O-H-H-H-H-H. The loud noise echoed throughout the island and they saw the giant crying his heart out. Usopp was now sitting next to him trying to calm down his teacher, as the liar called the giant for some reason. For the most of them it felt as if they were drowning. The amount of water Bragi let loose when crying was as a waterfall had been placed above them. Almost everyone was now holding their ears to make the loud sound hurt less. Naruto was entirely rolled up in a ball because of his sensitive ears. U-O-H, why my friend? Apparently he was crying because his friend had died. Naruto was pretty sure though that Dory was still alive. Almost as soon as he had thought that the crying stopped. He uncurled himself, his vision still spinning and impaired for a moment before it focused. Standing next to Bragi was Dory, who was slowly trying to get up without pressuring his wound too much. How? Bragi started, but Dory cut him off. The weapons, they're old. The wound I have isn't that serious, I don't think these weapons will hold on for much longer. Dory said, and Bragi nodded and started to laugh, hugging his friends. Bragi, if you hug me that much you'll hurt my wound. The giant said, but both of them were laughing. Thank God you have survived, my friend Gababa. What a splendid day this is. Let us thank the god of Elbath. Bragi yelled. Are you happy you finally landed a hit on me and making me pass out? Dory said in a playful tone, and Bragi just laughed. You know I don't mean that. As he hugged Dory once more. Stop touching my wound Gygya. Dory said, while Bragi just laughed, and all of a sudden they started a fit again, telling each other how he would beat him. The Straw Hat were laughing while Nami screamed at them to stop. Naruto just shook his head at their antics. 10 minutes later, everyone was having fun and relaxing a bit back at the cave where Dory normally stays. Naruto was taking a small nap while listening to the surroundings. Zoro, Vivi and Nami were talking to the giants while Luffy, Usopp and Karoo were eating senbei, wherever those had come from. Thanks, you little ones really helped us out there, Bragi said. Yeah, we'd totally forgotten we had those bounties, Dory continued. Yeah, but they would never have come here in the first place if it wasn't for me, Vivi said sadly, before she could continue her apology, though she was pinched on the cheek by Nami. Don't say that. She pointed to where Usopp, Luffy and Karoo were munching on senbei in ridiculously odd ways. Do any of them look like they're bothered? Nami asked her. She looked down. No, but. Nami pulled her face up and smiled. No buts. We don't mind and have forgiven you. Hell, we weren't even mad cause we don't even blame you for anything. Vivi smiled slightly and nodded while listening to Luffy kid around. Zoro though took the discussion in a more serious direction, but we're in serious trouble if we have to wait for the log to set before we can return. He said. Yeah, we can't wait here that long. Nami agreed. Can't you misters do something about it? Luffy asked, like it should be their life goal to do so. Most of them just shook their heads at the captain. Naruto had an eternal pose to Alabasta, but to get it he'd have to transform back and he just wouldn't risk that. Besides, he wasn't really planning on going with them anyway, so he kept quiet to see where the discussion would head. Surprisingly, the answer came in the form of that curly-browed guy he'd seen together with Robin. The man came running out of the forest with a loud yell, causing Naruto to open an eye in observation. Nami Swan. Vivi Kwan. I'm back. Thank God you're all safe. The guy yelled. Sanji. There you are. Luffy said enthusiastically, waving at the guy. Sanji came running towards them but stopped as he saw one of the giant. Woa. Are you Mr. 3? He said, taking a fighting stance. Nami, who was curious about how he knew that, asked him, but the guy pretty much just started to flirt with her and Vivi. Naruto was no longer interested in the pervert and closed his eyes. He could hear Sanji get pounded into the ground by Nami while she told him to explain where he had been. Sanji immediately obeyed her wish and told them that he found a small house in the forest and had entered it. Naruto listened attentively as he recognized the brief description of the small house. He told them he picked up a ringing den mushi there and ended up having a conversation with Crocodile. Apparently Sanji had told the man the mission was a success and that the Straw Hat crew had been eliminated. On top of that, he had found an eternal pose in the house to Alabasta. After hearing this, Naruto was a bit conflicted. He had to report to Crocodile in a couple of weeks at most. If Naruto told him the targets had all been eliminated, he would be lying and Crocodile would find out. But if he told the man they were alive, he'd be killing the advantage they had. He would have to think carefully about that later. At the revelation that Sanji had gotten them an eternal pose to Alabasta, everyone started to celebrate and Naruto couldn't continue his nap, so he woke up. The fox sat there watching all of them. He stood up once and slowly tried to walk away unnoticed. Of course someone from the Straw Hat crew noticed and alerted the rest. He who had stayed an unknown entity for 11 years, never noticed by anyone, was noticed by a group of kids who, for the most part, didn't have any training whatsoever. He really hated Cammy right now. Hey Fox, where are you going? You're going to join my crew, Luffy yelled, running to him. Naruto's first instinct was to get away from Luffy and unknowingly moved closer to the rest of the crew. Sanji, who had no idea, asked Vivi next to him. That is a fox, right? How is it supposed to join the crew when it's an animal? Naruto, who heard this, got agitated and Vivi noticed this. But before she could say anything, letters were appearing in front of Sanji's face. I am not an it. My name is Naruto and I am perfectly capable of communicating and thinking. Thank you very much. As for being an animal, I don't see Karoo being any different, and he helped Usopp defeat the enemy. Vivi laughed a bit while Sanji's mouth fell down in shock. Sanji-san. Naruto-kun has already heard the same thing several times today, so he's a bit frustrated. He's told us he's a fox yokai, so I guess that explains things a bit about the being an animal part, she told him. Out of the whole crew, Sanji was the fastest to recover and turned to Naruto. Well, Sorry for earlier then, it's nice to meet you Naruto. Naruto looked at the hand he had stuck out in front of him, he moved his tail and shook the hand politely. The man surprisingly had impeccable manners. Slightly embarrassed by his outburst, he gained a slight orange hue again. Damn it, I really have to get used to this fast. How the hell does Robin control this? He thought. Robin was just like him, not quite used to kindness, but he had a feeling Robin wouldn't show any embarrassment on her face no matter what. Haha, he's turning red again. Zoro yelled, laughing and holding his sides. Everyone turned to him and his snout flared up almost similarly to certain someone back in the elemental nations. Everyone started to laugh. Why the hell are you blushing for something like this? Sanji asked, a bit surprised by the change in reaction. Naruto curled up trying to save some face while the letters appeared in the air. I'm not used to this, okay? Everyone was still laughing and snickering, and this time Vivi asked. What do you mean? Not used to what? And please don't feel offended, it's just you're so cute like this. Everyone was nodding vigorously at the last comment and Naruto looked up from behind his tail, more indignant than embarrassed now. Don't call me cute. I may be a fox but I'm still a guy, and as for why, I'm just not that used to kindness, okay? He said, his blush receding a bit but still trying to calm down. Everyone quieted down a bit in compassion but nobody inquired any further, it was personal business. Anyway. They suddenly heard Luffy again, you will join our crew, right? Naruto's flush had receded entirely and he looked up and Luffy with a tilt of his head. Why? He asked curiously. Luffy smiled. Cause you're cool. Naruto's sweat dropped a bit. And that's a reason? He asked. Luffy nodded. Yeah, I'm the captain and I like you, so join my crew. He looked around and saw plenty of the crew stare at him with hope filling their eyes. What about your crew? He asked. Luffy turned around. You all want him to join too, right? They all nodded while Sanji just stared a bit before adding his own a small nod. See, they all want you to join, Luffy said as he turned back. Naruto sighed for a bit. He couldn't stay with them forever as he needed to return to Robin sooner or later, but maybe staying with them for a while wouldn't matter. He had a bit less than 2 weeks to return to Alabasta and riding with them would make the trip a bit more interesting. After that he could leave them and if necessary act like he betrayed them so as not be a burden on either sides. He sighed and nodded. Okay. But don't expect anything from me or you'll be sorely disappointed, he forewarned seriously. But most of it fell on blind eyes as they swarmed and welcomed him. They're the ones who'll regret it. Naruto thought absently, but somehow he had the feeling he would too. They all left for the boat, each saying their goodbyes to the giants. While Zoro and Sanji were discussing, really rather fighting, about who had caught the bigger prey. Naruto stayed in between them to make sure Zoro wouldn't start fighting physically with his feet just yet. Half an hour later they were all back at the ship. Zoro and Sanji had gotten their prey back to the ship. Though Naruto had gotten Zoro to get Luffy to help carry it. They were still fighting over which was bigger and neither would relent. Hey guys, we can't carry that much, so why don't you take as much meat as we can carry? Nami called out and Sanji immediately agreed, leaving only Zoro to bicker. Hey Usopp, mine is bigger isn't it? He asked, slightly annoyed. Huh, I couldn't care less. Usopp said, and Vivi joined in. Is a tie no good? She asked. But Zoro shook his head. There are no ties in a contest. Naruto just shook his head as he watched everything on the ship trying to withhold his laugh. After they had packed all the meat they were sailing down the river onto the ocean, when Luffy noticed the giants. Hey look, the giants have come see us off. The giants were standing at the edge of the island facing the ocean. The most important reason why all the little ones who come to this island, Bragi started. Do not reach, the next island lies ahead. Dory finished. You all risked your lives so our pride remains untarnished, Bragi carried on, thus in turn no matter the foe. We must not let your flag of pride be tarnished either. The both of them finished as their ship passed beside them out onto the ocean. Trust in us and sail straight ahead. No matter what happens, sail only straight ahead. Luffy repeated, straight ahead, determined while everyone else wondered at what the giants meant. Let us meet again in the future. Both added. Suddenly the sea started to bulge as a giant sea creature surfaced. Look ahead, Nami panicked. So you have come, Island Devourer, Dory started. In the name of Elbaf, we vow to clear the way. Bragi finished. The giant goldfish opened his mouth wide trying to swallow the caravel moving its way. Almost everyone on the ship was panicking as they sailed straight into the mouth of the giant goldfish. Nami and Vivi wanted to turn helm and get away, but Usopp, who was acting bravely for once, wanted to keep on going straight. Luffy and Zoro agreed. Naruto was having a nap and didn't really care, he was tired from all the worrying he had done that day. Sanji wondered on whether he could trust the giants. All in all, they ended up in the mouth of the goldfish. The two giants raised their weaponry into the air and gathered all of their strength into a single combined attack. Really all of their pent-up energy they called out together. Hikoku. The fish ended up having a giant hole in its body while the boat and its crew were sent out flying over the ocean away from Little Garden and onto a new adventure. The end. Thanks for watching. Also remember to subscribe and like this video. See you in the next video.